now that we have Ari, we can dive into today's session.
Oh,
I'm sure.
hello. Oh, you're waiting for me. I love it.
Hi, Ari. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. It's so good to be here. Happy New Year,
Okay.
everyone.
Happy New Year. Oh yes, my God, it's 2026, isn't it?
It is.
Happy New Year. Sand off.
Certainly off to a happy start. So there's our links as usual for those who want to follow the essay. We're in chapter 8 of Kenneth Smith's book Millennia and Microcosm. And this is week 173. Oh, dear God, 173 of our Millennia and Microcosm arc. It should go on for about another 3 years. And there will be plenty more Kenneth Smith after that until eventually I drop over dead of old age. But until that happens, for now, we're going to talk about medieval civilization, as we have been doing for the past year. We're in paragraph 20, and I think we might wrap up paragraphs 20 and 21 in chapter 8 completely today, depending on how it goes. Uh, David Orwell gives us our intro here. He says Kenneth Smith argues that Christianity was transformed into a system of psychological conditioning that appeals to humanity's lowest motives, fear of punishment and hunger for reward, thereby corrupting intrinsic values like love, awe, and moral intelligence into an amoral mechanical obedience. He contends that the doctrines of heaven and hell represent one of the most catastrophic turns in church history, debasing spirituality itself by replacing inner judgment and intrinsic goodness with intimidation, conformity, and emotional manipulation. And as usual, David is, I'm always grateful to David for arranging these, so, setting up the meetup invites and the links and the recordings and the live streams and publishing the recordings on YouTube. And of course, he writes these little paragraph intros each time. He almost never comments unless somebody really gets his goat. He might come briefly off of mute, uh, but uh, but he knows as much about this stuff as Donald or I or anybody else who's been immersed in Kenneth's work for a long time. So don't let his introversion fool you. He's an important part of these seminars. Uh, as usual, we are not only starting. I'm just going to repost this exact same thing again because two more people have joined. Hi, Jason. Hi, Joe. Welcome to the call. So there's our links and there's the introductory sentence from David. And now let me drop in our usual little bits here uh, in addition to get us started for today. Just a reminder of what we're doing. This chapter is about divine teleology, heaven and hell. This is the chapter 8 is the chapter where Kenneth is talking about the transformation from early Christianity to mainstream Christianity, which, and by mainstream I mean we're talking about medieval Christianity. None of this is about the modern world or modern forms of religion, including modern Christianity. All of this is about the medieval world and how it arose out of the ancient epoch. And so he's talking about how things changed from Jesus's message to say the second, third, fourth centuries, and the way that the emphasis shifted from whatever it was in the early days to what it became, which was, as Sharon likes to say, sort of a tool of control, a tool of empire. And that involves some distortion. And we're in the final two paragraphs of chapter 8. He's Kenneth's going to bring this to a close. But a reminder for year 2 of the medieval civilization, which we're in now, we're taking we're modifying our approach. We're supplementing Kenneth's writing with primary source materials and additional secondary materials from medieval writers. We want to let them speak. And part of the reason we want to do that is a lot of Kenneth's focus in this arc about medieval civilization is about the transformation from ancient to medieval and about the transformation from Jesus to the established church. And in doing that, he focuses on half of the dialectic of the medieval era. He focuses on the mainstream religious empire that is being created for the next 1,000 years. But that's not all there was to medieval civilization. Kenneth knows it. He considers important, but doesn't put as much focus on in these chapters the other half of the medieval dialectic, which is for all that the religious empire tried to stamp out heresy and establish an orthodoxy and then, kind of commit it wanted to commit religious genocide across the whole world to convert everybody to Christianity, have nobody left who's anything else. It wasn't able to pull that off around the world for technological and scientific reasons. It also wasn't able to pull that off even in Europe, because even in Europe, there were always dozens of heresies. And as we're discovering in this discussion that we've started out with, talking about the earliest evidence we have for Christianity, it appears that that was the case from the beginning. Not that they were heresies, but that the earliest documented forms of Christianities that we can find evidence for show a multitude of Jesus communities that make up this movement. And these different communities have different ideas about what was the important part of what Jesus said and did. And many of them don't seem to know about each other. They diverge very strongly within just a few decades after Jesus's passing. So, the traditional position that there is an unbroken chain of apostolic succession that goes from Jesus to his disciples, and then to the broader apostles, and then to the bishops, and then from the bishops to today, and so therefore you should do what your bishop tells you. That appears to be a manufactured history developed during the second, third, and fourth centuries. Because the evidence that we can find is that there was not originally, after Jesus, there wasn't a single unbroken central line of orthodoxy that represented the correct Christianity, with all the others being the heresies. Week before last, Stephen talked about, he did a presentation about early stages of Christianity, where he talked about the apocalyptic strand in Christianity, which is an important one that we won't get to today, but we will get to it. It's incredibly important in early, as Stephen knows, it's incredibly important in early Christianity. And there are other strands as well. Now, what we're doing, and so to that end, we talked about the gospel according to Thomas a month ago. For the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been talking about the Q source, which is the evidence that Matthew and Luke had a second source other than Mark that they were referring to when they wrote their own respective gospels. They both had Mark in front of them, and they both had something else, because they have so much in common. And that's been for 150 years. That's pretty much been hypothesized to exist as the Q source. We're finishing up I think we'll finish up our studies on Q this week, either this week or next week, and then we'll move on to the next. What we're using to talk about Q and early Christianity right now are 2 books by Burton Mack. The first one, which I'm reading right now, is called Who Wrote the New Testament? It's exceptionally good. And Burton Mack's goal in this book is not to present his own theory. His goal in this book is just to present what is largely the consensus among biblical scholars, so that the general public can be brought up to date with where biblical scholarship is today. Since most denominations have not incorporated the kind of discoveries from the last century of biblical scholarship yet, it comes as a surprise or even a shock to a lot of people to hear that among scholars there is this wide agreement that a lot of things that are taken for granted as true are no longer considered to be true, at least not historically true. They may remain mythically true. And the other book, which we've been focusing on more before, but it's still useful to look at, is Burton Mack's The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins. And I put a link there in the chat to the text of Burton Mack's translation of Q. The whole book that he wrote, The Lost Gospel, is available. You can for purchase. You can purchase Who Wrote the New Testament. You can purchase The Lost Gospel, and he points you, especially in the opening chapters of The Lost Gospel, he points you to all of the writers who have written over the last 150 years of biblical scholarship on these subjects pertaining to Q, and also kind of what the main kind of trends were and focuses were in biblical scholarship. Now, what we're doing today is a little different, and I announced it at the last of our last seminar. What we're going to talk about today is, I realized as I began reading Who Wrote the New Testament last week, that it's a chancy proposition to try to talk about early Christianity without talking about Judaism. What is the history of Judaism? Where did it come from? What were its main thrusts? And what was on the mind of the Jews in the century leading up to the emergence of the Jesus movement? If we don't know those things, then how are we supposed to understand what it means that the Jesus movement even arose? That's the context. We skipped that part. So I thought today I would walk us through some Jewish history that I've learned, and I'm counting on Ari and others to correct me in the many places I will turn out to be wrong, but at least I can present a little outline of some of the main ideas. And as part of that, I'll also be including some of the most recent breakthroughs in understanding the history of the Tanakh, how the Jewish scripture was developed, and the sequence in which it happened, and also the development of monotheism among the Jews, which current archaeology suggests took a lot longer than most of us think. The official story we had is they've been monotheists for just about forever, but the new scholarship suggests it's a more interesting picture than that. So that's where we are. That's what we've talked about. That's kind of on the agenda for today. As always, this isn't a lecture. You know, at any point, people can raise their hands, and I'll take a break from yakking, and you guys can talk, and I'll ask questions and discuss with you. This is we're exploring this together. We're exploring this text together. All right, so let's get started. Part of what we talked about last week is this idea that before the era of the city-state, what Kenneth refers to as the ancient epoch or the classical epoch in his book Millennia on Microcosm, there was an older epoch. And in ancient Greece, the older epoch collapsed into a dark age before the classical epoch arose. Around 800 to 776, the founding of the Olympic Games is around the time that the Homeric hymns and epics begin to be written down, and a number of things about Greek religion and culture, the classical Greek religion and culture, start to come into focus. But older than that, you have the Mycenaean civilization, and they're quite different. Even though the Greeks look back to them as their forebears, they're quite different. And part of what's different about them is that they don't have city-states. The classical Greeks imagined that they had city-states, right? They imagine, like we do, they take their present and project it backwards into the past and imagine it was sort of like now, only more primitive. And they imagine it was more heroic. But the archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. It suggests that it was an entirely different epoch. And there is an author who has written on this material named Jonathan Z. Smith, who evidently put out what's currently considered to be the authoritative book on the temple state. He put it out in 1987. I'm still chasing down the book and the title. But Burton Mack says it's pretty much what all the scholars go to if they want to understand kind of what's beginning to emerge from the science of archaeology about this older epoch. The end of the older epoch, I had up until now in these discussions, I'd said that it ended with the Bronze Age collapse. It ended with, the Mycenaeans do the Trojan War or something like it. They fight against each other. They tear each other's city-states apart, and they kind of go pirates all over the Mediterranean. They become sackers of cities, going from city to city, tearing them down, looting them for treasure, raping all the women, blah, 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 and then sailing on to the next one. And the only major temple state that didn't collapse in that era was Egypt, which is how we know these people existed. We have Egyptian inscriptions that talk about the so-called sea peoples who came from the sea and tried to sack Egypt. But Egypt, of course, is a long, narrow country. Most of the power of Egypt is away from the Mediterranean, and they could draw on that strength to fight back and ultimately defeat and repel the sea peoples. But all over the Mediterranean, long established civilizations all collapsed in a short time, just a century or two. And there are obviously a variety of explanations. Could be disease, could be climate change, could be all kinds of things. But we also know there were these roving bands of pirates and brigands who were destroying everything. So that had been what I talked about before. But what Burton Mack says, and based on Jonathan Smith's writing, is that this older temple state period, it may have collapsed in a lot of places, but in others, it reformed and continued for quite a while. And we might argue that it continues right up until the Roman defeat of Judah and the destruction of the Second Temple at Jerusalem in 73. That might be the turning point. And he sort of argues in Who Wrote the New Testament in the first chapter that when the Jewish exiles came back from the Babylonian captivity and created the Second Temple in Jerusalem and created the temple cult and began writing down the Torah and everything else, that what was happening is that they were trying to recreate the lost glory of the earlier temple state system before they were conquered, before they were before they were defeated. And so what we see in them is sort of like, if for those of you who know classical music, it's what we see in Bach, the elder. These amazing Baroque compositions that he's doing are almost after the Baroque era. They're at the end of the Baroque era. A new wave in music is arising. And a lot of the reason that his work is so glorious is that he has an entire epoch's worth of learning to look back on. Bach does, and he's combing it for the very best things that people have done. He's got a whole bunch where he transcribes, for example, Vivaldi's concertos and then reworks them into new forms. And so it's part of what made him so glorious is that he's sort of the swan song. The owl takes flight at the owl of Minerva takes flight at the fall of night kind of phenomenon. And so Burton Mack argues that the Second Temple period is like that. And part of his argument for that is that under the temple state, as we said last week, there are three critical classes that rule over the general population. And it is the balance of power between these three that defines the temple state. And the first is the king, who holds all the power, including the military, but has no purity, because by acting with power, he does terrible things in the world. And sometimes he has to do terrible things, and sometimes he's just a jerk. But either way, there's no purity in him. And so in order to make a righteous kingdom, you also have to have a priestly class who are all about purity and purification, but they hold no power. They control no military. And so how on earth do these two alien poles work together to create a whole? Well, it's through a scribal class, a class of anonymous scribes who mediate between them by writing down the law codes and the histories and the prophecies and so on. And they create the body of literature. And as they do that, they have a tendency to edit. And so we use the example of the Code of Hammurabi, which starts by, kind of shamelessly flattering Hammurabi for page after page after page, and then says, everybody's going to be bound by the following law, which implies even Hammurabi is going to have his hands shackled by the Code of Hammurabi. And the current thinking is that part of it was probably not Hammurabi's idea. That was probably the anonymous scribes wielding their power as the third ruling class by, on the one hand, flattering him, so he wants to take credit for it, but on the other hand, helping to close the divide between the common people and the king by making them both subject to the same law. And this kind of mediation, this three-part mediation, was the core of the Old Temple state system, according to Jonathan Z. Smith. But after the Babylonian captivity, when Jewish religious leaders and political leaders come back home to Judah and they set up the Second Temple state, they're not free to have their own king. They are still under the domination of a foreign power. So in effect, they're creating a modified version of the stool with three legs that only has two legs. They try to think as little as possible and talk as little as possible about the foreign kingdom that runs them. And they try to make do with just the priests and the scribes, helping them to become a very religious and religious oriented people. Because the age of David and Solomon is behind them. And in this way, what they have created with the Second Temple system is not actually fully a true temple state like they used to have before their conquest. It is as with Johann Sebastian Bach. It is an homage. It is their swan song to the old temple state system. Yeah, there's all kinds of great history here to talk about. So let's talk about what we know about the history. We're just going to sketch our way through it and cover about 1,000 years of history here in this first hour. But first, Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I figure I got to do my civic duty and fill in some lacunas if I can, if there are any. So there's another big part, according to Rabbi Sachs. Now, he's not the authority, but he is definitely a big authority. And he also looks at, and interestingly enough, is very quiet about things like J and E and P and all these kind of sources for the Tanakh, which I'm sure you get into later, which I think he and a lot of other great rabbinic scholars recognize a lot of the truth in it, but it's kind of a quiet secret that you're not allowed to talk about because it breaks a spell. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest it, but it's better for a kind of sort of a belief effect and a placebo effect to run with a narrative, that this is all from, right? And this is all about levels of like how much of an adult you are is what kind of truth you can handle. So for the people that are at the lower end who need to get their goodies and need to get their, rewards in heaven or whatever it is, then you have to pander to the masses to some degree. So it's a mixed bag. But anyways, the point is, Rabbi Sachs would say there's a third component to all of this, which is definitely standardized from internally the Jewish perspective. Whether it's validated by history is hard to claim because it's not the type of thing that you're going to find so much, I guess, evidence for, which is this idea that there's a role of prophet, and the prophet is supposed to rebuke both the priests and the kings. And essentially, the prophet represents the crown of what's called the crown of Torah, which really is the crown of knowledge. So that and knowledge is accessible to anyone. So essentially, whoever gets the right knowledge essentially makes the right forecast and is essentially aligned with what he thinks. He sees the writing on the wall of what, literally, that's where that comes from. The writing on the wall is a prophecy of what you think God wants to do. Then you become the prophet, and the prophet is supposed to hold accountable the priests. And you see this specifically in what's in the later, so in the Tanakh, the later parts. The first part is the 5 books of Moses. Everybody knows the Exodus kind of stuff going to the land. But the later stuff is often really just really rebuking people's behavior and rebuking kings' behaviors, or specifically, I would say, priests' behavior. It talks about all these offerings that are garbage because they're very corrupt and duplicitous and hypocritical. And so there's a lot of critique. And so it makes sense that like you need like to some degree, not it's the same thing, but this idea of the American system where you need a system of checks and balances where each party has someone holding them accountable. And if you don't have somebody holding you accountable, you're in trouble. So theoretically, yes, the king and the priest are supposed to hold account of each other. But what happens when they get in bed with each other? That happens, or they become the same guy. This is actually how apparently the temple period ended for the second temple, which was the priest was often a purchased thing, and he was often sometimes the king himself, and he would last for less than a year, and then he'd die or get executed, whatever. It's just awful Machiavellian stuff. And I would posit my own question. It's not really a hypothesis, but it makes sense that for sure, to the first temple period, and even the writings about it, which is necessarily after Reconstruction later, represent the temple period, a hybrid between a temple state and a city state. If the second temple, it has aspects of the city state, and I think it definitely does. We see this where the city state is creeping, especially the relationship with Greece and eventually the Hellenization of a lot of Jewish stuff. I think that means really this transition to a city-state lifestyle versus a temple-based lifestyle, and it has to do with the centrality of power and that kind of stuff. But I will say the key component that you've missed, and whether this is valid, because prophets in this case is all like magical thinking, if this is talking about miracles and stuff. But apparently, according to the literature is that the third pillar of all of this is indeed the prophet. And the prophet represents whoever, let's say, essentially knows the Bible best, which in this case represents someone like Jesus. If Jesus were just a prophet and he knows the Bible best, so to speak, knows the information the best, then he would have the access, and all the kings and all the priests should then listen to his instructions, so to speak. Anyways, okay, that's it. I'm done. I think that's enough.
That's brilliant, Ari. Thank you. Yes, this history of criticism built into the system is a very interesting feature, and I can see the relationship between that critical function of the prophets on the one hand and what becomes the later rabbinical tradition, that you don't just accept the scripture, you wrestle with the scripture, and you wrestle with other people's interpretation of the scripture, and you document all of this and create this ongoing, what you might think of as the proceedings of the ongoing conversation that Jews are having about their religion, their history, the use of power, and so forth. So let's. I'm glad you added that. So I'm gonna back us up to the beginning, and the opening consideration about Judaism is, we're beginning with the early stages of Jewish history. It's widely recognized that at one point, like everybody else around them, the Hebrews were polytheistic. And by a later point, like say the first century, BCE, we know they're monotheistic. And what does the transition between those things look like, and how does that happen across the history? And at what points does it happen? And here, we're going to deal with the difference between mythic history and actual history. In actual history, we have to go based on the evidence that we can find archaeologically and elsewise. But for mythic history, we can go based on what the people say about their own history. And it's any group, kind of, especially before the development of modern historiography, the approaches to history are very much focused on the reason to teach history is to teach lessons. You're trying to teach about characters, you're trying to teach about virtues, you're trying to teach about big pivotal sacred events that help to define us as a people, and what those things mean and how you use them is revised over time, which is something we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So the current assumption by most people who are doing kind of early Jewish, or I don't know if I should say Jewish, early Hebrew studies, is that there are these in-between stages that we're going to see in their history, where they shift from polytheism to henotheism, we'll talk about in a moment, and then monolatry before you get to monotheism. So what are these stages? Polytheism is you have many gods. Henotheism is you may have many gods, but one of them is more important than the others. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. You might belong to the Canaanite religion and be polytheistic, but you're going to move Yahweh's image to the front of the rest because Yahweh's better than the rest. Or another variant of this that I was reading about this morning is a form of henotheism that the Jews in particular do, where regardless of who's the best, Yahweh is our God. He's the one we have a covenant with. He's the one that we're interested in. He's the one we have a relationship to. And questions of who's the biggest, some people might indulge in that and consider that a Jewish preoccupation. But other Jews would say that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Somebody else's gods are somebody else's gods. For us, this is our God, and this is the God that we work with. This is another form of henotheism. And there's evidence both in the text of the Tanakh, the Jewish scripture, and archaeologically to suggest this stage of development out of polytheism towards monotheism. It was a real thing for at least a few centuries. Likewise, you get to a later stage, monolatry. And in monolatry, you sort of say, those other gods aren't even gods. They might be angels, they might be ancestor spirits, they might be saints, but whatever they are, they're not gods. There's only the one God, and then there's this sort of pantheon of kind of lesser servants, or they might be demons. Christianity goes through a stage where it says all polytheistic gods are demons. They're not actually gods at all. This is all monolatry, where you're sort of saying there are these other things, but they aren't what you think they are. And then finally, you get to monotheism, where they're saying those other things aren't even real. They don't even count. There's just the one God. And there was we're gonna talk about the traditional position is that the Hebrews switched to from polytheism to monotheism almost immediately. As soon as the possibility comes up, they all switch. There might be a few lapses, but generally that's what they stick to. And that's how it's been for a long time. But recent archaeology doesn't bear that out. Recent archaeology suggests that the idea of monotheism and especially the idea that the ideal religion should be a monotheistic religion, it arises fairly early, but it doesn't appear to have been widely adopted. It looks like there were Jewish priestly sects that took it very seriously from early on, but that the general population didn't. They might have been familiar with that there were these sects who believed this, but in the homes that they're finding as they do archaeological investigation, they're finding shrines to multiple gods, and these are Jewish homes. They show all the signs of being Jewish homes, except that they're not monotheistic. So there was a study in 2022. A book was published, and let me see if I can find us the name of that book. Oh, here it is. This is Jonathan Adler, and his 2022 book is The Origins of Judaism. The Origins of Judaism. Let me drop that in here. And he's basically including decades of archaeological investigation and decades of textual investigation of the Tanakh, and coming to the conclusion that many of the practices that we think that we used to think go back to 1000 BCE, might only go back to, in terms of the whole population, or most of the population of Judah, might only go back to the 2nd century. So there's an article from the Smithsonian, Is Judaism a Younger Religion Than Previously Thought? And there's a link to the book, The Origins of Judaism on Wikipedia. And basically the practice that he did is he says, by the time we get to the 1st century of this era, everybody agrees the Jews are monotheistic. There's no evidence of polytheism among the Jews, starting around 0 or 1 or 2. And so he says, in addition to the monotheism per se, he's going to make a list of kind of some of the most important religious practices, purity about what you eat, the ritual bathing, the Sabbath being set aside. There's a list of them. If you read the article, the Wikipedia article and the Smithsonian article, you'll see a summary of those things. And then what he did is he went back century by century, 1 century at a time, and says, how much evidence do we see for these practices in the 1st century CE? Well, lots. They're obviously monotheistic and fully practicing most of what we recognize as Judaism by then. Although, as Ari has pointed out before, there are changes that happen after the collapse of the Second Temple. And then he goes back to the 1st century BCE and asks the same question. There's still good evidence for all of it. But when he goes back to the 2nd century BCE, you find most of the evidence by the late 2nd century, but you find not a lot of it back in the early 2nd century. And when you go back before that, he's not really finding anything, especially 4th, 5th, 6th back. And so the hypothesis, which is emerging, which is not generally accepted yet because it's recent and it confronts the status quo in terms of people's belief systems, is that it was specifically during the Maccabees period, the Hasmonean period, when many of the features that we think of as Judaism spread beyond just the priestly class and the ruling class to the entire population. So this is just a hypothesis, but this is the hypothesis that's currently based on the predominance of archaeological and scholarly evidence. And of course, it in no way repudiates the mythic truths, because as you know on this call, we care a great deal about mythic truths. What does a people believe about themselves? How does that affect their character and their behavior? It has a real force in the world. I'm going to so let me take us through a couple of highlights in the stages of the things that we think we know. So we know there is a northern kingdom of Israel by the 900s. It might have been there before that. It's a little less clear, but by the 900s, we're pretty sure that it's there. And there is evidence by 850 BCE of Judah in the south. And so we start out with this, Judah could have been there before, but we just don't have the evidence to be sure. So what we start out with is this 2-kingdom model: Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And they're both clearly present by 850. And before that, the evidence sort of trails off. We think there is a traditional date in the 900s for when the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, was built. But the clearest evidence we have takes us back as far as the 700s. We're less clear before that. It may or may not have existed, or there might have been an earlier temple that was wooden instead of the grand, stone temple. But by the 700s and 600s, we've got what is clearly what's identified as the first temple. And the Neo-Assyrian Empire invades and destroys. They've built other temples by this point. Neo-Assyrian temple invades and it destroys the temple at Bethel. It destroys the northern kingdom of Israel, and Judah becomes a client state. So the northern kingdom of Israel sort of corresponds to what we think of now as Samaria, the source of the Samaritans. And to this day, the Samaritans still use a version of the Bible that only includes the Torah, the first 5 books, and nothing else. The Samaritans, as we will see, are the ones who were not dragged away into Babylonian exile. All right, so this takes us to 586. And we're gonna jump ahead to 586. That's when the Solomon's temple, the first temple in Jerusalem, is also destroyed, and the this is traditionally dated as the beginning of the Babylonian exile, when the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which succeeds the Neo-Assyrian, it finally decides not to allow Judah to remain a client state, but instead defeats it, smashes their temple, and it drags off the Jews. This is the beginning of the Babylonian exile. But a lot of analysis now suggests that many of the Jews were not taken. We know the Samaritans weren't taken. They were left behind in Samaria, which used to be the northern kingdom of Israel. But even in Judah, there's some evidence to suggest that what they did was they took the priestly and upper class, they took the educated classes, and they left the common people behind. And so they really damaged the kind of cultural, intellectual power structure of First Temple Judaism. And of course they replaced. So what they've done is they've replaced the priests and the kings in the old system of the temple state with Neo-Babylonian authority. The Neo-Babylonian the Babylonian exile lasts until 538. I don't know why I thought it lasted for centuries, but it doesn't. It's it's about 50 years, 48 years. And that's when Cyrus the Great gives his great Edict of Cyrus that says the Jews can return to Judah, and they begin to repatriate. And when they do that, it really starts the Second Temple period. This is when they want to regain the glory that they had back when they had their two kingdom model and they were a complete temple state. They're not fully allowed to because the Babylonians are still in charge of everything. But they decide that even within the umbrella of a foreign power holding the kingship, they're going to do everything they can to recreate the old temple state system of Judaism. And the point that Burton Mack makes is it works surprisingly well for a stool that's only on two legs, because they're not relying on the Babylonians to provide the kingship role of the old system. The Babylonians don't respect the Jewish religion, so the relationship between a Babylonian king and a Jewish priesthood wouldn't be anywhere close to the old temple state system. So they just ignore the king and they do a two-legged system, and it works surprisingly well. So from the 400s to the 300s, under the Persians who succeed the Neo-Babylonian Empire, things are going well. That's when Alexander the Great comes in, and Alexander the Great conquers everything. All the way to the boundaries of India. He conquers down into Egypt, and he conquers this too. And everywhere he goes, as we said last week, he smashes the old temple state system. It's gone. And when for purposes of the Hebrews, when we say he smashed the temple state system, we don't mean that he attacked the Hebrews. He attacked the Persians, who were in control, and he overthrew them. He took over the Persian Empire and he turned it into a big Hellenistic, kind of pseudo-Greek empire, if you will. And interestingly, after he takes over and is Hellenizing everything, the Second Temple kind of quasi-temple state system within this Hellenistic city-state framework, where people are increasingly learning Greek. Nevertheless, the temple state system still seems to be working under the Ptolemies, his successors. Things don't become a real problem. Let's not yet get to the problem. Let's get to the next interesting. No, yeah, let's go right to the problem. The problem starts around 200, and the problem around 200 is that the Seleucids, who are the successors to the Ptolemies, they're sort of neo-Hellenistic. They take over and they decide all of the vestiges of the old temple state system have to go. Everybody needs to be Hellenized. Everybody has to speak Greek. There's going to be, we're gonna have theaters everywhere. We're gonna have, stadia everywhere. They're just aggressively changing everything. And the compromise that the Jews have been holding together for centuries, ever since the return from the Babylonian exile, it starts to fall apart. They're being pushed. They had already been Hellenizing, under the Ptolemies, but now they're being shoved, and they don't like it. And the result is guerrilla warfare. The Hasmonean lineage from Idumea in the south starts leading guerrilla warfare, and eventually they manage to defeat the Seleucids and instate a Hasmonean dynasty of a new Judea, a new Judah, in which it weirdly, despite the fact that now that they're in control, they could actually genuinely create the original temple state system. They don't. And I don't know the reasons for this. I haven't looked into this history deeply enough. But they change the two-legged quasi, temple state system that they had. Instead of having the scribes and the priests, they now combine the kingship, which they've reclaimed, with the priesthood. So the same people act as priests and kings. And this angers many Jews. They do not like what the Hasmonean dynasty is doing. So like, this is our chance to go back to the old temple state system. Why are you screwing this up by trying to hold two pillars? I mean, of the same stool and the same people. It's just what it does is they say you're going to contaminate the purity of our priesthood, and it's going to lead to corruption. And by doing that, you're then going to lose the leash of purity that you previously had upon the kings, because now the king and the priest are the same person. Whatever they want to do, they think, well, God must want me to do this. I just feel like doing it. So there, you can't stop me. So with that power, the Hasmonean dynasty then aggressively annexes Idumea, Samaria, Transjordan, and Galilee. And so now, in addition to angering all the traditional Jews, they anger all the people from the surrounding kingdoms who've now been conquered and are sort of forcibly being shoved into this allegiance that they don't care for, that they don't like. And we talked about this a little bit last week. Several things come out of this as a result. One of them is that some of the priestly families from around Jerusalem, seeing the corruption of the religion that's being caused by having the kings claim to be priests at the same time, they withdraw from Jerusalem and they form a commune on a barren shelf above the Dead Sea called Qumran. And Qumran is famous as the place from which we have been recovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, from which we recovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. That appears to be who it was. It was this angry priestly class. And at the same time, another group breaks away from the Hasmoneans, and they establish, they basically they agree with the counter-Hellenistic ethical and religious push of the Maccabees, but they disagree with the corruption the Maccabees are introducing by being both priests and kings at the same time. And they double down on being non-Hellenistic. They're trying to shove a new era where people are going to pull away from Greek and do more Hebrew, and pull away from cosmopolitan compromises and get more back to the original culture. And these are the Pharisees. The Pharisees. So the Pharisees and the Qumran community both emerge in opposition to the Hasmonean dynasty. And they, with their continual, this is going to what Ari was just talking about a few minutes ago, with their continual criticism of what's wrong with the current generation of priests and kings, they wear down and demoralize the Hasmonean dynasty. They wear down the Maccabees until, well, and before we get to that stage, I want to throw in one more little piece of history under the Maccabees, which I learned today, which is that during the Maccabean era, John Hyrcanus, he destroys the Mount Gerizim temple in Samaria, and now the Samaritans hate the new Judea every bit as much as later the Jews are going to hate the Romans for destroying the second temple in Jerusalem. I mean, this is like a horrible blasphemy from the perspective of the Samaritans. And this was part of the conquest by the Hasmoneans, and it explains part of why everybody's just so angry at the Hasmoneans. What's interesting is that the Samaritans continue to isolate themselves from the rest of the Jews to this day for the next 2,127 years. This event under the Maccabees creates a fracture in the Jewish community that has never healed. All right, so this finally takes us to the end of the Maccabees period, because we've got two fighting Maccabee brothers, and one of them, who's going to succeed to the throne of the Maccabees, and one of them appeals to Rome for help, and General Pompey, who's famous from the histories of Julius Caesar, says, "Sure, I'll help you." And he takes over the whole area and calls it Palestine. It becomes a Roman province. And that is the end of the experiment with Jewish self-rule. It lasts for that long, and it's over. And from then on, Rome appoints both the high priests and the kings. And at this point, you could say, on the one hand, in terms of substance, the old temple state system is gone, because now what we have is a sham, where the who's selected isn't based on who the Jews believe is most pure as priest, and who the Jews believe could be the most righteous wielder of power as the king. The Romans are appointing whoever they think will keep the peace and keep the tax money flowing, and that's all they really care about. And as part of that, granted, they are listening. They're not trying to appoint anybody who really pisses off the population. That's more of a later fiction. They're trying to they're appointing compromises, and we all know what that feels like. You've got compromised priests and you've got compromised kings, and this lasts until 73. It lasts for a little over a century, when the Romans finally removed the last vestige of the temple state by destroying the Second Temple. So this is an outline of the history, kind of the deeds and the events. And what we see is that starting in the 200s, you've got a lot of people who identified as Jewish, who are marinating in this Greco-Roman culture. First under the Ptolemies, then under the Seleucids, and then finally under the Romans. And likewise, the period the area that we think of as Israel, Idumea in the south, then Judah above that, and then Samaria above that, Galilee above that, and then Transjordan, and the Decapolis to the east of Galilee, Syria to the north of Galilee, and Phoenicia on the coast to the west of Galilee. All of these areas together are they're all different kingdoms, and they all have different experiences under this, and many of them would never think of themselves as belonging to the same group, because they've got history with each other. So I'm going to talk in a moment about the creation of the Torah and the Tanakh, based on the current scholarship. But just this sketch of history, kind of, if we overlap this with the insights from this new Origins of Judaism book, which suggests that a lot of the practices we associate with modern Judaism weren't there before the 2nd century. What we see that lines up on the timeline is that's when the Hasmonean dynasty took over, right? When for a brief time, was that about 79 years, the Jews are actually ruling themselves again, like they once did before the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered them. And during that time, the new hypothesis is that's when the shift from in some cases polytheism, in some cases henotheism, in some cases monolatry, when that finally shifted to monotheism, it's believed to have happened during that period. And likewise, that's when observance of the Sabbath and the dietary purification, the baths and so on, when these things stopped being the practices of the priestly class and isolated sects, and became the practices of the whole Jewish population, was kind of during this period. And when the Maccabees were overthrown by the Romans, apparently this new generation of practices, where what previously had been priestly practices now became the general practices of the whole population, that stuck. And whether it would have stuck if the Hasmonean dynasty had ended some other way, not by foreign conquest, who knows? But there's something about, you could be really angry at the Maccabees and want to get rid of them, and still not want the answer to be, how about we get conquered by the Romans instead, right? And you could see how the fact that it succeeded by a Roman takeover could result in a certain kind of patriotism, right? A desire to preserve what you can of your culture, even if it had been sort of forced on you in the earlier generation by the Maccabees. You might still want to hang on to it, even though you got rid of the Maccabees themselves. There's some interesting things going on here in terms of this history. So there's a sketch of the history, and before I get into the Tanakh and the Torah, Ari, is there or anybody else on this call, are there any corrections you want to make to this? Things you know about early Hebrew history that's probably important for the discussions going forward. I'll just pause.
I did have a few quick thoughts. There's really nothing wrong, but there might be some small changes, or at least this idea that what all you're discussing, at least from what I understand, is still really significantly argued, and there isn't much consensus. There are some leading candidates for like stories, but like the jury is still out, so to speak, on reconstructing a lot of this. And the scholar that I followed, who I actually had the pleasure of learning from in person at University of California in San Diego, is a man named Richard Friedman, and he wrote a book called the Who Wrote the Bible? Through all the classic E and J and P and D, and just gives his own more evidence aligned approach to that. But I heard him also more recently give a hypothesis that a lot of what we're seeing as this one people was actually like, let's say, 12 tribes. And the tribe of Levi, these are the people who served at the temple, were the warrior class, and they were the ones that came from Egypt as slaves, mixed with things like the Hittites, who, in some sort of slave rebellion revolt thing, came, and they were much smaller in their numbers than it suggested. And rather than like conquer the new world and remove all the old, really the all the old was actually the already existing 12 tribes of Israel, and they were just sort of put under the sword of these Levites that came out of Egypt, and they brought the canon of this whole narrative of the Exodus from Egypt as being ethnic. He uses the kind of propaganda of the era to get all of the Israelites eventually to think that they're one big group that all left Egypt, even though it was like one smaller group. And again, there's not so much consensus on this, but this is apparently more popular. And it's just interesting to see that this narrative has much more complexity than probably we can imagine. And the only thing that is much more likely is that it is constructed over time. And it's not this like, it was always this way kind of thing. I'm definitely not in that camp, even though strangely enough, there are many, many people who feel that there is an unbroken, unbiased chain of transmission of information from back then to now that is just how things we do things now is pretty much how we did things then. And to me, it's just like I want to smack my forehead with this kind of preposterousness that there are so many things that have changed. And more than anything, it's like this Dunning-Kruger effect that I only know enough to know that there's a vast amount of stuff I don't know. Like that's really the most important takeaway, is that my actual signal within the noise is pretty small. Like my amount of information is small, but I do recognize it's a narrative, and I also recognize it's the best kind of option I have in terms of relate, or I don't know, being in reality. So it's kind of a choice, but I recognize that it's not the best in terms of of that. Um, it's also worth mentioning that in that timeline, you said things much earlier, which this Yonatan or Jonathan guy, um, that may or may not be really like everybody agrees and likes his stuff, or it's really controversial. But you're saying that's like 200-300. In these other scholars, they seem to think that the leaving of Egypt story, regardless of how big the group was or who they actually were, happened somewhere like 900 BCE, or even some people date it closer to like 1200, which is crazy because that's really right around when the and people even correlate that it's related to the bronze, the era, the fall of the bronze era, because you had in the story you have all these refugees coming to Egypt. It's the only place where there isn't famine, and in these sort of stories for the collapse of the Bronze Age, they say that there's famine and um, the sea peoples, and that there's also not famine, but famine is man-made. What's the one when there's basically a drought? There's drought and famine. Excuse me. There's famine and drought and sea peoples. This is what the authors argue. But they say that's like 1200 BCE, or at least they argue that it could be as far back as that. So again, we don't really know, and it's best to know that we really have a very low resolution on this, and that's okay. That's okay. It's the best we got. Right. That's all I got. That's all I'm gonna say.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, this is consistent with what you're saying. The emergence of the Hebrews as a people is sort of a separate question from the emergence of the specific Jewish kingdoms we're talking about. And again, it's separate from the emergence of the monotheism. They all sort of run in parallel. And the Hebrews as a people, that goes way back. And it could easily accommodate exactly what you're saying about certain tribes coming out of Egypt, being there during the Bronze Age collapse because it's a place where there's food, unlike a lot of places throughout around the Mediterranean and Near East. So that's and I agree with you 100% about, we really don't know. We're really still learning about this period. Um, and part of why it's hard is, for example, it's very hard to go digging around, in Jerusalem looking for the first temple of Solomon because you'd have to dig underneath holy sites. You'd be disrupting people's lives and their churches and synagogues and mosques. And it has made it extraordinarily difficult to try to find concrete evidence to pin down exactly when was the stone temple that we think of as the first temple built. And it's part of why there's a lot of guesswork here. Yeah. But the good news is that there is a lot of investment in archaeology in that part of the world, and so we're always learning new things and keeping an open mind about this. I'm with you. The amount of signal I have compared to the amount of noise, I only have a very small amount of signal, and this is all relatively new to me. I'm excited that you got to study under Richard Elliott Friedman in person, and I put the link there to the Goodreads site about who wrote the Bible, and I'll go pick myself up a copy of that because I'd very much like to read about that.
I'll also say it's worth mentioning my mother is actually in contact with him as an author. And so if we actually want to ask him any questions or anything, he like kind of remembers me in person, kind of like the way you are with Kenneth Smith. So if we want to ask a scholar, we could send him a question and he'd almost certainly give us an answer, at least according to his opinion. So
that is
anyways, it's a resource we could use.
That is fantastic, Ari. We will certainly do that. We'll certainly do that. I mean, this is we've talked about Judaism and the Jews a little bit so far during the medieval section, but you may remember when we first started into medievalism, I said I wanted to put some real effort into expanding our exploration of medieval Judaism and medieval Islam and other medieval religions as well. Having a source like that so near at hand is very exciting. So over the course of the year, we'll look for opportunities to pitch questions via your mom. Thank you for offering that. Well, let's talk about. I'm assuming that Richard Freeman might be one of the sources for what I'm about to talk about next, which is the parallel history of the development of the Tanakh and the Jewish scripture. And of course, that's important because in its own sake, it's important to understand Judaism, but also anyone who wants to understand early Christianity or wants to understand medieval Europe, we got to know these roots. We got to know, where is the current scholarship about the emergence of the Torah specifically and the Tanakh generally. So, summarizing some of what's known. Oh, and I didn't put the rest of the links there. I'm a bad boy. Let me just plug in a couple of links real fast in that edit so that we can get all the bits in there. I put the link for the Elohist, but not the article, but not for the other three. And I'm going to fix that right now. So there's Elohist. Here's the priestly source. Let me put that in there. And let me find the Deuteronomist. I'm sure I have that here too. Right. Where'd it go? There it is, Deuteronomist. Okay, so the current model for the development of the Tanakh is that, especially for the Torah, especially, but is that there are these four major revisions. There are these four sources. If you follow any of these four links, most of the articles will have a little diagram. Maybe the Deuteronomist doesn't, but which one could you use? You could use the Elohist article. That's got a good diagram in it, and it shows the current hypothesis as of the end of the 20th century about how the different layers of writing occurred. Now, there's some disagreement about the dates. Some like the Yahwist, which we used to think was the 10th through 9th centuries BCE. Maybe now we think it's a slightly later than that. But the general relationships appear to hold as far as figuring out who had access to what when they were adding their revisions. So one of the ways that they identify this, and you don't have to be much of a Bible scholar to notice, if you do even a little scratching the surface, you see that the way that God is referred to changes in different passages in the Torah. There's places where he's referred to as Yahweh. There's places where he's referred to as Elohim. There's places where he's referred to as El Shaddai. And and these correspond to different authors according to the current model. That different authors were working, on different layers, different revisions of the Torah, and an enormous amount of scholarship, a huge number of Jewish scholars and general literary textual scholars has gone into developing this current consensus. Now, the consensus is not a consensus shared by everybody. There's, as Ari was saying, and Adonai, yes, all of this stuff is still under debate and discussion. But the frame of reference, even when people disagree, the frame of reference they're disagreeing with is this basic model of the four layers. And so the Yahwist appears to be the oldest layer, at least one of the very old layers, and the Elohist is another one, and they appear to be from different parts of the world. Different parts of they come from different parts of what we think of now as Israel. So the Yahwist layer of the Torah is centered in Judah, and as of the diagrams of Wikipedia and general consensus, they think that goes back to the 900s or 800s. But there's a new theory that suggests it's later than that. Maybe it only goes back to the 700s or 600s, because it seems as though the Yahwist authors seem to know about the books of the prophets. There's some language overlap that suggests it might have come a little later. But anyway, it's somewhere in there. The Elohist layer, which is either a little younger or a little older, depending on if we use the older new dates for the Yahwist layer, those layers of the Torah seem to be centered in Ephraim rather than Judah generally, and a later redactor has access to both the Yahwist and Elohist sources and merges them to create what we might call the JE redaction or recension. And that's a major turning point. They can identify that there's a stage where those things have sort of been brought together. Now, in what I've said so far and what I'm going to say to follow, you got to understand there's an enormous disagreement about how and why these things came together. Some people think that the way it came together is that there was a written Yahwist source and there was a written Elohist source, and the JE redactor put them together to create a written JE, merge. That's one theory of how this happened. But there's another theory that says that's not the case, that the Yahwist material might represent, for example, scraps or fragments or pieces of a tradition or an oral history, and likewise the Elohist, and maybe the JE redactor was not a JE redactor, but was actually the first author, and that they pulled these pieces together. This was the stuff they knew about, and they wrote it down to create the JE later. All right, so however it happened, we've got that in the 600s. There's the Deuteronomist historian kind of composes their layer of the Torah, and as you can see from the diagram over on Wikipedia, it might have been two different historical groups. An earlier Deuteronomist group, a second Deuteronomist group that influences it, and then a redactor, a group of redactors who pull it together, who pull those two different sources of Deuteronomy together. And at least the first Deuteronomist historical group who are writing seem to have had access to that JE redaction. So it's influenced by the JE synthesis. Likewise, shortly thereafter, in the 500s to 400s, there's a priestly historians layer of the Torah that's written, and this priestly layer doesn't appear to know about the Deuteronomist, but they do know about the JE layers. They have access to it, and what they do is they write their priestly works, and informed by that. And now where this leaves us in time is we end up with three major sources. We have the JE source, which combines the Yahwist and the Elohist. We have the priestly source, which is its own body of writings, but seems to have been aware of the JE combination. And we have the Deuteronomist text, which has some tangential relationships to the JE, but is largely the result of the Deuteronomical work. And into this mix, where you've got these three different sources, the current model is sometime in the 300s, some group of literary redactors who have access to all three of those sources pull them together, edit them heavily, and interpolate their own new material to create what we think of as the Torah. And that's the current framework. And almost certainly every one of these dates is off to some amount. And it's as Ari alluded to earlier, the true picture is probably more complicated than this. This is just a model to kind of suggest this kind of processes of development. But you can see a couple of interesting things that happen on this timeline. It suggests that the Yahwist layer and the Elohist layer, they predate the construction of Solomon's temple. They predate the construction. As far as we could tell, there could have been something there earlier, a wooden temple, but they seem to predate the creation of the big marble temple, and they predate the conquest by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So there is a lot of anger that you see in the later writings towards these conquerors that's missing in the J and E layers. They have different goals. Once the conquest happens, the Deuteronomist layers and the priestly layers start to have different concerns, and you start to get some of the history of what follows, which is missing from the JE layers. Given that the second Deuteronomist historians layer comes in the 500s, probably after the destruction of the temple, and given that the later D redaction that merges the Deuteronomist layers happens later than that, it could be that the Babylonian exile predates some or a lot of the Deuteronomist material. It certainly predates the priestly material. And the priestly material in general, most of that appears to be written after the return from the Babylonian exile. So there's a sort of we can imagine that what's happening is, I think about this as sort of analogous to the way that classical Greece lifted itself up by its own bootstraps out of a dark age. Where 776 time frame, they decide they're gonna engineer their own culture, take all the best features from before the dark age of their ancestors, but they're going to try to not repeat the same mistakes. They're going to try to create a new culture that wields the Greek tribes together. And so they start the Olympic Games, and they start the Olympic pantheon, and they all these things that they're doing consciously, as on one hand an homage and reconstruction and Renaissance, but on the other hand a reaction against and an attempt to correct the excesses of the past. And in some ways, the Second Temple period, which begins when the Jews return from the Babylonian exile, or at least the priestly and intellectual leadership classes return, it corresponds to this rise in Torah activity, where all the priestly writings are being created and where they're synthesizing all of the works that they have around them. And one of the things that happens in this period that's interesting is that, and I didn't know these dates before this morning, but this is useful for the classical or medieval periods to know, is it's somewhere in the range between 284 and 245 BCE that Ptolemy II Philadelphus it decides to establish the Library of Alexandria. And as you all remember from the stories, the Library of Alexandria is basically trying to it is the world's earliest massive collection project. They're attempting to get everything that anybody's ever written in one place. Alexandria is a major port city. It's a major trade city. All kinds of ships are coming through there. And the rule that's established is every ship that docks gets searched, and all of their scrolls and books are borrowed, quote unquote. And while the ship is in port and doing its business, the scribes at the Library of Alexandria, which is part of the museum, are busily copying those books to create new copies. And then the promise is that they're giving back the originals to the ships but it is widely suspected that what they gave them was the copies and they kept the originals. And so there is this active collection and writing down that's going on, and it launches one of the most distinctive characteristics of the Hellenistic period that separates it from the Hellenic period. Kenneth Smith talks about this a lot elsewhere. He says the earlier Hellenic period, Athens, Sparta, the classic age we think of, is an age of innovation when people are making bold, radical explorations of ideas, like Socrates, saying, I would die for the truth. But the Hellenistic period is not like that. It's a period of collectors and librarians and academic scholars and annotators. They're commenting upon other people's work. They're collecting other people's work and comparing and cataloging. Enormous numbers of catalogs, begin to arise as a result of this. And one of the hypotheses is that the idea that all of the writings that become the Torah should be collected together into the Pentateuch, the one collection of 5 books, and that it should have a relatively fixed set of contents. It really happens, they think, in reaction to the establishment of the Library of Alexandria. There's a great deal of Hellenic interest in the Hebrew histories. The Greeks take a keen interest. They start to form little clubs and associations throughout the Middle East where they gather around synagogues. I was just reading about this morning. I didn't know anything about this. They form these clubs around the synagogues where they say, I know I'm not a Jew, but I would love to learn, and write things down about what do you believe and what's in the scripture. And some of them, because we talked last week and the week before about all the dissatisfaction with the Greco-Roman world that's caused by the smashing of the temple state. You have all these upended people who used to have a culture that was plugged into a political economy, and now the temple state political economy has been ripped away from them and replaced with this Hellenistic city-state economy, which is a poor match for their old temple state beliefs. There's this feeling of everything is in flux, everything is in chaos. I don't know what I'm supposed to do in the world. I have a set of values. I'm thwarted in my attempt to live according to those values because the taxation system doesn't work and the king's not accountable to me and all that crap. And so you have a lot of people who are looking for new answers. It's a time of creative ferment. And what Burton Mack says, and who wrote the New Testament, is that clubs formed around synagogues made up of Gentiles who wanted to learn about Judaism and wanted to write it down. And that combined with the establishment of the Library of Alexandria leads to a rabbinical movement or let's say a scholarly movement, a scribal movement within the Jewish culture that says it's time for us to start settling down our text and getting a single established collection of these are the books that are in and these are the books that are out. And what is the text of each book? And they start that process in reaction to the founding of the Library of Alexandria and all this interest. And it takes centuries for them to settle it down. The stuff I was reading says, even in the time of Jesus, we find textual differences between different copies of different books of the Tanakh. The scribes haven't all brought together. They haven't compared and contrasted all the copies from all the different Jewish communities to make sure they say exactly the same thing. They're still, this is a problem the Christians are about to have, but it's going to come up in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries that they've got different copies of Mark floating around, different copies of Matthew, and they don't all agree with each other. The Jews already have that problem, but they don't see it as a major problem until there's all this external interest saying, well, what does your book say? And they're like, they come to get two different Jews from 2 different parts of, one from Samaria and one from Judah come together and they compare their copy of Genesis and they find they're not the same. And it's leading to this scholarly work that has become central to Jewish culture. The careful study of the text, line by line, letter by letter, making sure you know exactly what it says. This gets accelerated in response to the Roman smashing of the temple system and the breakup of the final end of the Jewish temple state system. When that happens, it provokes a crisis because many copies are burned. There are fewer variant copies of the Tanakh running around, which on the one hand in a really uncomfortable, terrible way, solves part of the problem of having a bunch of variants that don't agree with each other. But Rabbi Akiva, who dies in 135, before that, in reaction to all of this, he stresses the importance of we need to eliminate the variations and get into agreement about exactly what the text says. And the text, any two copies of the Torah should not differ even in as much as a single letter. It should be identical everywhere. The quest to do that, to get a single copy of the Torah, will continue for the next 900 years. It takes a long, long time to work out the variants and figure out where all the vowels go and put in the accent marks for pronunciation and everything else. It's a long process. And a big part of it, which goes through the Middle Ages, which I didn't know about. I thought this stuff had been resolved before the medieval period got started. But no, the 600s through the 1000s of the current era, you have the Masoretes who are developing this practice of error-free scribing, in which they're trying to make sure that they don't introduce new errors when they're making copies. They bring that level of authenticity to a level of sorry, I don't mean authenticity, I mean of precision in copying to a level that the world's never seen before. And they get to the point where they're now completely faithfully copying the various manuscripts they have, and now they can see that they don't all agree with each other. It culminates in the 1000s with the Ben Asher group and the Ben Naphtali group, and their two different copies have 875 differences. 9/10 of them are just placement of accents, but 1/10 of them are they don't have the vowels and consonants in agreement. So they haven't fully resolved it until the end of that. So sometime in the 1000s, they finally end up with the one text, which letter for letter pretty much doesn't deviate for the rest of history. They've got it. It's now copied methodically for the rest of time. So this is kind of in nutshell a history of the development of the Torah. And obviously I'm doing short shrift to the rest of the Tanakh. I'm not really talking here about the poetry, about the histories, about the prophets. I haven't actually got into that part of the writing yet. But I was very surprised by all this. And part of what's going on is among the Jewish communities, there is a renaissance. At the time of Jesus, there is on the one hand a renaissance, a Jewish renaissance in the number of people who can speak Hebrew, the number of people who can read the Torah, in having complete copies of the Torah that are being copied more carefully than they ever were being copied before. In the notion that there ought to be a canon. We shouldn't just have a bunch of books that are floating around the Jewish world. We should make our decisions about what's in and what's out. That's going on at this time, which, by the way, is ahead of the Christians. They're not going to figure this out until the second, third, and fourth centuries, but obviously influences them. And the part that I was always missing is these kind of interesting, what do I call them? Judeophile clubs of Gentiles that are gathering around synagogues throughout this area and taking notes and copying and studying and comparing what the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh say to what Greco-Roman beliefs are, and trying to line them up and say where do they align and where do they not align. That's evidently the big ferment that's going on around the time of Jesus. And just a reminder from the last 2 weeks, Jesus coming from Galilee is coming from a place that isn't specifically Jewish. It's a place that is completely cosmopolitan. There's Greeks, there's Romans, there's Jews, there's Syrians, there's Phoenicians, there's Samaritans, there's Syrians, there's all kinds of people are in Galilee. And so this whole idea of clubs that are studying Homer, and they're studying the Cynic philosophers like Diogenes, and they're studying the Torah and other writings, that they're looking across all these traditions, trying to think, what the hell are we supposed to do now under this soulless Roman Empire, which doesn't meet any of our spiritual or emotional or value needs? What is to be done here? How, obviously this isn't the future for us. So what is the future? What are we going to create? out of this mess. This is pretty much what's on everybody's mind. The Jews are thinking about it for their reasons, and the Gentiles are thinking about it for their reasons, and the Jews and Gentiles are talking to each other a lot in Galilee. And here endeth my little run on history for today. Questions, comments, concerns about this backdrop? Was all of the, did everybody know all of this already? People are curious about anything? Corrections? What do you got for me, Ari? I know you know the history of this text far better than I do.
I'm boring. I don't think I have anything else to say. I'm trying to wonder more specifically what things need to be most salient for moving forward. Because you just did a big information dump. So it's like, which one of the pieces are we supposed to really focus on? It's hard to know where you want to go, but I don't know. That was great. Everything you just presented. I don't have any disagreements, and I'm not sure if we need to add anything.
Okay. Okay. Well, given that, let's connect the dots then. I wasn't sure. Oh, go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I have a question. So what you just described, it seemed like the arrangement of the Jewish text and the Christian text, were they going on side by side in the medieval society at the time, or were they consequential? And how did this impact the functioning of the society as a whole?
Those are great questions, Sharon. Thank you. So basically, the Jews are figuring out that they need to select which of their texts are going into the Tanakh and which are not. They're figuring that out before the Christians by several centuries. And they figure out long before the Christians the need to have an error-free process of copying and a resolution of the different source texts to agree on a single text that's going to be the official one. The Christians take much longer to figure that stuff out. There is overlap, but the overlap is curious. It's not like they're exactly doing the same thing at the same time. It's sort of like when you sing a round or a canon, and you come in on the next verse, and the guys already sang that verse are now onto the second verse. And this is sort of where it is with the creation of these two sets of books side by side. At the time that the Jews are pretty much settling down what's in their Tanakh, the Christians are still writing books like crazy. Throughout the first and second centuries, it's an explosion of books coming from these early Christian communities. They're a long way away from establishing a canon. It's not until sometime in the 100s that somebody even thinks to propose that there should be a Christian canon. Up until then, all these different Christian communities are each going their own way, and they each have their own books, and what other groups are doing, they don't care. It's not until you start to get to the process of thinking that it's going to be a single unified religion and that we're all going to believe the same thing and have the same books, which starts to emerge under the bishops in the second, third, and fourth centuries, especially towards the fourth century, that the question of what's in and what's out becomes a pressing question to the Christians, the way that it was to the Jews in the first century CE.
Yes. So that's going to be the other part of my question, because the Old Testament, the books in the Old Testament, I am guessing a lot of them are also in the Jewish scriptures, the Jewish text, right? So the exclusionary process at that time meant that they had to have some interactions between the Jews and the Gentiles to construct this text.
Yes. Yes. And part of the reason for that is that among the 7 or 8 early Christian sects that we have evidence for, one of the sects that we have evidence for is specifically Jews who convert to Christianity and say that to be a Christian you have to follow all of Jewish law. Those people in particular, who remain a strong thread for a long time in Christianity, they are very interested in the work that's going on in parallel with the Tanakh and establishing the canon for what's in and what's out. Interestingly, there are these Maccabees books that the Jews decided to leave out of the canon. The first 2 Maccabees they decided to include in their Deuterocanon, their sort of supplemental canon of non-canonic but interesting reading materials, but other Maccabees books were left out entirely, as well as a lot of other material. The Christian communities partly took their lead. Yeah, we're going to talk about Marcion in just a second, Stephen. You're right on it. The Christian communities partly took their lead from the Jews about what they would consider to be the Christian Old Testament. But in some cases, by the time they established the canon, later, in the 400s, they actually break with the Jews a little bit, and in a couple of ways. And we mentioned last week that one of the things they do is they flip the histories and the prophets, because in the Tanakh you have the Torah and then the writings, which includes the poetries and the histories, and then you have the prophets second, and then third you have the writings, which is the poetry and the histories. And the reason for that order is that the Jewish Tanakh is structured in such a way that it ends with Malachi saying, okay, so we're going to build a house for God, and all the people are going to come together and worship. It's basically a big arrow pointing at the Second Temple period. This is the purpose of the Jewish Holy Book, kind of from the beginning to the end is to lead into the Second Temple, and justify it. But when the bishops take over, and they flip the order in what they call the Old Testament, and they flip it to put the prophets last, so that it ends with the prophecy of the one who is to come. Or is that Malachi who's the prophet? I may be mixing up who said which. But the one who is the prophecy of the one who is to come is the end of the Old Testament in the Christian version, to specifically set up the Gospels, which say, "Hey, behold, the one who is to come has come, and here he is." And so that rearrangement of the order that happens between the second, third, and fourth centuries. That's part of their editing process. The other part of their editing process, which is interesting, is some of the books that the Jews excluded from the Tanakh, the medieval Christians decide to include. And that becomes an issue later in the Reformation. Martin Luther and other scholars look at these differences between the Tanakh and the medieval Old Testament, and they conclude that some of the things that have been part of the medieval Old Testament, the Protestants want to exclude. Right? They become no longer accepted as canonical. So there are these breaches in practice that happen as a result of these changes over time. But what they all have in common, and what informs Jewish culture and Christian culture very strongly, because of both of them struggling with this question of which books are around, is to be included, is that they both become very scribally focused religions. The creation of monasteries all over Europe, the Christian monasteries, where you've got monks all day long copying scripture to make sure it's not lost, to make additional copies, incredibly laborious processes, to get it all in there. And then over time, they start to follow the Jewish example of trying to be more careful, to introduce fewer errors, and to make sure their copies are not screwing anything up. This focus on scholarship and replication and authenticity, it's a cultural transformation. The Greeks and Romans didn't have anything like it. They when they made copies of books, there were often errors. We have lots of copies of ancient Roman and Greek texts for which there are multiple versions, and the versions disagree in all kinds of ways. But the thing you're talking about, it leads to the development of what we might eventually call today's universities. The culture of precision and accuracy and documentation, the culture of looking at manuscripts and commenting on them, writing your own catalogs and commentaries. All of this stuff comes out of this. So yeah, it ends up having a big impact. A big impact. When we eventually get to Islam, it's going to emerge there too, as a major factor for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. As Stephen notes in the comments, Marcion, who at first is not considered a heretic, but eventually the emerging new mainstream bishop-centered group of Christianity gets angry about his ties with Gnosticism, and they reject him and declare him a heretic. But before that, he was actually a major figure in early Christianity. He decides that there should be a canon. He's the first Christian to follow the example of the Jews and say there ought to be a canon. We shouldn't just have piles and piles of books that are floating all over the place, and we don't know which ones tell us something about Jesus and which ones were just written by somebody yesterday. This is not acceptable. He says it's a chaos, it's a mess. And at the time he's saying this, no other Christian agrees with him. When he's like he dives out ahead of everybody else. That this is, in other words, he's trying to establish a canon at a stage in the development of Christianity in the early second century, when even the people that we will later associate with the canon haven't decided there should be a canon. Right? The group that becomes the orthodox version of Christianity, that establishes the canon, establishes the central practices, and becomes Roman Christianity, and instigates the medieval epoch. At the time Marcion is writing, they're starting to exist, but they didn't think there should be a canon. That didn't occur to them. And so, yeah, Marcion's a businessman who strongly believes in organization. So he's like, no, there needs to be a canon. I need to exclude all the gospels that aren't real. He's very picky about what he includes and excludes. He's one of the first guy to look at the collection of epistles that say that they're written by Paul and say, I don't think these were all written by Paul. I only think these ones are. I think those ones are, forgeries or fakes, or he excludes a bunch. And later scholars will mostly follow his lead when it comes to which Paul epistles are legit and which ones aren't. But they don't follow his lead about the Gospels, because he only keeps one of them and throws the rest out. And that plus his ties to Gnosticism are why he ends up being rejected. And he ends up in the second century acting as the spur in the Christian community. Even though they reject him, they feel like he's making them look bad, because this idea of having a canon, I mean, even the Jews have a canon. They're not Christians at all, and they've got a canon. And Marcion, who they've declared a heretic, he has a canon. And so the kind of central, what emerges as the central power thread in Christianity, decides they have to have a canon too. And it takes them several centuries to get one, but they start into that work in reaction against Marcion. By the end of the second century, kind of what's trying to become mainstream Christianity is beginning to form a canon for Christianity. So again, lagging behind the Jews by a goodly amount. The Jews have this settled long before. Okay, so well then I'm going to keep going until 1, at which point I'll switch to Kenneth's text. And using the time that we have left, why don't I connect the dots from this Jewish history to the early Christian stuff we've been talking about? Interestingly, you know how we've talked about, man, God, and nature, the three sources of meaning that in the existentialist tradition define these epochs, the difference between the ancient epoch where it was nature, then God, then man at the bottom of the totem pole. And then we get the medieval epoch where they overthrow nature and they say, no, we have a supernatural God. He's above nature, and nature is nothing but his creation. So now we've got God, then man, then nature, which, man is appointed to rule over. And then in the modern epoch, the revolution is they overthrow God. And they say, the reason we're overthrowing God is not because we're opposed to God, but because we don't trust the people who claim to speak for God. And so instead, we're going to have markets, and we're going to have parliaments, and people will just man is now on the top of the totem pole, and people will get together and decide what is meaningful and what are we going to do. And under man, we'll have nature and God as things that we decide about. They're sort of at the bottom of the totem pole now. Well, Burton Mack says that in the time of Jesus, there is a different set of concerns. So if we think of the ancient Greek triad as phusis, that is nature, the character of nature, theos, which is the gods, and anthropos, which is man, Burton Mack says the preoccupation after the Alexandrians and the Romans have smashed the temple state and stirred up all these people who are now rootless. They have these cultures and values, but they have no way to express them. He says the concern shifts and it becomes cosmos, polis, and anthropos. Now the anthropos part matches, obviously, that's man. And the cosmos part matches too. I don't know if you guys remember this. I think it was Thales. It might have been a later commenter on Thales who says, "Phusis is to the cosmos as psyche is to the somos." That is, the laws of nature and becoming are to the actual universe as our own character, our psyche, our soul is to the somos, our body. So Phusis and Cosmos are talking about the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. So we basically have nature at the top and we have man at the bottom. But in between, remember, these were temple states. The politics were also they were also the religion, right? Even though it was split into two classes, the king class and the priestly class, they worked together, mediated by the scribes, to be the governments that ran things. So they had an equation between the what you might call between the religion and the Phusis Theos Anthropos. Yeah. So Hegel's triad. So the reason that they switch from talking about Theos to Polis here, that Burton Mack does this switch, is he says because the problem facing everybody from the time the Alexandrians come in and smash everything through the time when the Romans are in charge is that their political religion, their religious politics, the economic basis for that has been wiped away, and they're being having foisted upon them first by the Alexandrians and then by the Romans this Greco-Roman model of the polis, the city-state. Except that, as we talked about last week, the city-state has been corrupted by being used as an instrument of war, of subjugation, instead of as an instrument of uplift, where a people decides to crawl out of a dark age by welding their tribes together into a polis and governing themselves. In other words, it becomes a prison or a shackle instead of an act of liberation. And because of that, the polis of the Roman Empire and of the Alexandrian empires, the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic that precede it is not actually replacing the temple state with something viable that they can have as solid ground under their feet. And it's provoking a crisis. And the crisis is you have these people with this understanding of the world and this value system and no way to connect the two anymore. The glue that used to connect them, the old temple state's gone. And the thing that's been proposed in its place, the city state, the polis, it has been gutted of all of its meaning. So they have a crisis, and the crisis is at the political layer. They none of their existing mythologies solve this problem because their existing mythologies predate the conquest by the Alexandrians and the Romans. It can't account for the new political reality that they face. So what's happening is this is why they're all studying each other's epics. They're reading each other's epics, they're forming clubs, they're learning each other's languages, they're learning each other's histories, and they're basically searching for answers. The Jews are searching within the Jewish culture, but also outside of it. These early Christians are searching. All kinds of other people. The Greeks are searching. The Romans are searching. There's a massive amount, and the Library of Alexandria is playing a role in this by kind of collecting together everything that's been written and acting as a source for circulating the knowledge. So there is basically this sense that we need a new mythology, and the Jews are able to delay it until the Romans smash the Second Temple. But at that point, even the Jews are having to search for kind of a new mythology in the sense of a new political economy that's tied to religion in a way that makes sense of the world, that makes people feel like they have a place in nature as well as in the human world. That's the struggle that's going on, and that's what's on everybody's mind. And Burton Mack summarizes it as three essential factors that this new mythology that everybody's trying to come up with has to address. And that is, how do you define the law? How do you understand political power? And how do you describe personal virtue? What is supposed to be done and how does that tie into nature? How are politics going to be linked to that law so that they become an instrument of that just law? And then how is an individual human being supposed to behave within this context? Especially if you got a context where you imagine a new state, a new kind of kingdom, but that you're not allowed to have yet because the Romans won't give it to you. They're ruling their way and not the way that you think you should be ruled. When the Jews think about a Messiah, when the Jews think about, okay, we have to save our sacred scriptures in the wake of the collapse of the temple and come up with a new way to practice our religion that doesn't depend on a temple that isn't here anymore. All of this is a search for a new integration of religion and political economy. And Burton Mack's argument is that early Christianity is exactly this search, that what Jesus was talking about is exactly this search. how do you live a life of personal virtue and form a new community when you're being governed by an old system that has no soul and it frames in and limits what your choices are? And he argues that according to the earliest layers of Q and Thomas and a few other fragments that I was reading about this morning, the earliest layers suggest that what these various communities share in common is the idea that Jesus's message has three core parts. He's basically answering this in three ways. And the first thing he says is, obviously, we need a new political economy that is a righteous, just political economy that brings together, religion, the sacred and the natural and the human into a new combination that's capable of working. And he calls it the kingdom of God. And this isn't to be understood in the way that the Gospels understand it. This is to be understood in an earlier sense. The kingdom of God is much like Augustine is going to say later. What defines the kingdom of God above all is that it is not the kingdom of man, not the kingdom of Rome, not the kingdom of Alexander, not these failed kingdoms that have fallen apart, but some new way that we could live together. And that we should really be devoting a lot of time to thinking about that and describing it. It's a utopian project, but not an idle utopian project. Burton Mack says one of the interesting things that characterizes these early Christian communities is the way that they discuss the kingdom of God, not as something that happens after you die, and not as something that happens after the apocalypse. That's going to come later, after the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem. It's going to be tied into the apocalyptic thinking. But rather, the kingdom of God is something that we could have right now if we just decided to live that way. There's nothing stopping us from doing it. Not really. I mean, we would get pushback at some point, but we could get a long way towards the kingdom of God right now. Kind of this notion of heaven on earth. The second, and this is there anything new in this? Well, what's new in this is that this is without all the other stuff that gets added later. It's without Mark, without Revelations, without Matthew and Luke and John. It has a completely different character at this point. And what's new about it is that the Romans don't care for this. The Romans want you to love the Roman state. They want you to fit in and don't rock the boat. And having people running around going, well, obviously this all sucks, so what are we going to do next? Is a very contra-Roman thing to do. So that's a part of what's new about this. The second part is the notion of a diverse cosmopolitan membership. A diverse cosmopolitan membership. And this is the part that comes not out of Jerusalem, but out of Galilee. Because Jerusalem, although somewhat cosmopolitan, I mean, they're Hellenized Jews, it was until recently very focused on the Second Temple. Whereas Galilee is genuinely a cosmopolitan crossroads, the Silk Road and the Mediterranean. And so it's made up of people that came from everywhere. It's as we like to say about the United States, at least we used to like to say about the United States, it's a nation of immigrants. This is how Galilee thinks of itself. We all came from everywhere. We all speak every language. We learn how to get along together. We're interested in each other. And we want to form a community in which, and this is what's new, in which it's possible for us to get along together despite the fact that we are different people. We're different tribes. We're different cultures. Somehow, we have to make this work. And the process of making that work and the rules for making that work that we learn as we go along will be part of the definition of the kingdom of God. It's how we can stop squabbling and fighting and feuding with each other. How we can stop standing by while our brother is dragged away by ICE. How do we have solidarity with one another when we don't come from a common origin the way that the Jews do in their epic, but instead we come from all over the place and somehow have to hang together. So that's the second ingredient that all of these early Q communities seem to have. And the third part is the idea that anyone could join at any time just by deciding to make the effort and make the changes. That is, it's open to anyone. There aren't people who are chosen or not chosen. There aren't people we include or exclude. The goal is anybody's welcome. They just have to agree we're gonna behave well together. We're gonna try to make this kingdom of God together. This is a project that we're embarking upon. And what's interesting is he sort of argues, and that's sort of the end of it. That's every other part. I mean, other than we do have a collection of aphorisms and fragments, but that go with this, that are consistent with these three parts. It says, but everything beyond that, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the apocalypse, Joseph and Mary and James and all the rest, all of that stuff appears to come later, which would suggest that Jesus's message wasn't as specific originally as the later gospels will have it. His message was, this is a thing we should do. We don't have to just submit to the Roman Empire and just be Romanized citizens. And we also don't just have to retreat into trying to be Jews and fight a hopeless battle against this giant authority that will just crush us over and over. And that strand, by the way, comes stronger and stronger in Christianity, especially after the Romans do invade and crush the Second Temple. But the notion is we just the act of engaging creatively with other cultures, other religions, and people from other tribes, and thinking, how do we sit down together and make a community? And that part of it is that we go out into the public and we question the status quo. We invite people in that old Diogenes style to wonder whether the status quo is really all that good, to see the inadequacies of it, to see the ways in which the morality of the Roman Empire is hollow, but so was the Alexandrian Empire before that. That all of these things they're not the satisfying food for the soul that they purport to be, and that we should work together to create a replacement for them. That this was the core of the message. And Mac's argument is that's why, even though we've got nothing directly from Jesus himself, the moment we start seeing evidence from early Christians about what they believe, they apparently all believe different things. Because it's as though Jesus's message was, go forth and be creative and figure out how to solve this problem. And each different community built up its own set of guidelines and rules that took it in a different direction. So some of them became, he was a wisdom teacher and here's his aphorisms and we're going to live according to that life. And some of them became, okay, we're all going to try to be Jews and live according to Jewish law. And others became, this is all terrible. The Romans are terrible. The Roman age has to end. We look forward to the end times when we will achieve the kingdom of God. And that becomes the apocalyptic strand that Stephen was talking about. Another group becomes focused on miracle stories, another on pronouncements. Each of these groups, in theory, is being true to Jesus's core message, if Jesus's core message was not a prescription that tells you exactly how to live. If his core teaching was, this isn't going to work, what we're doing now under the Roman Empire isn't going to work, and we need to form new communities and engage creatively with religion and nature and figure out how to do this thing. Then you could explain why the Q Christians sound so different from the Paul Christians. Because the things they disagree about aren't the things that Jesus was talking about. This is the stuff that they did in response to his challenge to them to go forth and start to form the kingdom of God, explore how to do this, how to make new communities. So out of this, we end up with, we have evidence for 8 different versions of early Christians. And I'm just going to drop them in the chat here. We strongly suspect there were a lot more than 8. This is just all we have evidence for, right? It's sort of amazing we have any evidence at all. If these were social clubs and associations and they were getting together and sharing meals and debating ethics and morality and current events and religion and different cultures and thinking about where do we go from here, of course they're not writing a whole bunch down. They're not trying to create a record. They're trying to create together. They're trying to explore. They're trying to exist together and be people together. So it's sort of amazing we have anything written down at all. So I'll just go through the 8 real quick. The first is the community of Q who produced the sayings Gospel Q. especially the Q1 layer, the earlier sayings layer. Although later, as we saw in previous weeks, they start to react to having people push back against them, and they start to introduce some of that apocalyptic stuff that Stephen's talking about. That those who don't listen to Jesus will be judged, that there will be an end times. That emerges as a second and third layer of Q. Then there's the Jesus school that produces the pre-Markan pronouncement stories. Mark is famously among the four Gospels. Jesus in Mark makes a lot of pronouncements. They're not aphorisms, they're not parables, they're a different kind of thing. And some collections of these pronouncements start to circulate, and Mark grabs most of that stuff and incorporates it into his gospel. So they think there must have been a community that was the part of Jesus they were interested in. Then we have the group that called themselves the true disciples, and they started out with Q. They produced the Gospel of Thomas, and eventually they become popular with the Gnostics, who between the 2nd and 4th centuries, the evidence might suggest that they become the dominant form of Christianity. Although they're painted as heretics, the reason that there's so much written against them by what we think of as mainstream Christianity is that mainstream Christianity were the upstarts who were trying to push back against the Gnostics and replace them as the dominant form of Christianity. But their story is going to come later. We're not really going to focus on the Gnostics, other than to see how they came out of Thomas. And in Thomas, you see that there are a few Gnostic sayings, but most of the sayings smell like and sound like Q and show the evidence of emerging from these early sayings communities. So that's the true disciples. The next group, the fourth group, is the congregation of Israel, and they compose these pre-Markan sets of miracle stories. Sets of 5 miracles, in which the first miracle is the walking on the water, and the last miracle is the feeding of the multitudes, and the 3 in the middle are healing miracles in which some non-Jew Gentile features prominently. And together, they're trying to portray this idea that it is forming the community and working together is a magical thing that we're doing. It allows us to overcome obstacles that seemingly would be impossible to overcome. They're kind of that flavor of wisdom story. The 5th group we know about only because Paul writes about them in Galatians, and it's a group called the Pillars in Jerusalem. And other than what Paul says, we have no evidence for them and know nothing else about them. We don't know who they were, what they were about, except that from the way he characterizes them, they seem to be different from any of the other groups we know about. There's a 6th group called the family of Jesus, or sometimes call themselves the brothers of Jesus or the brethren. And here too, we only have a handful of clues. In the later Gospels, they're portrayed as actual brothers and an actual family. But the earliest evidence we have suggests that it is like the other communities, it's a group of people who came together and decided to be a found family and to try to be true in their way to the teachings of Jesus. But we don't know what that meant to them or how they expressed it, because that's all the evidence we have. Yeah, there's a group that says it's an apocalyptic cult from the beginning. We'll talk about that in a bit. There's a 7th group. These are the congregations of the Christ, and this is what leads into Paul. And this shifts the focus from Galilee to Syria, and then to Asia Minor, and then to Rome. And eventually, this later develops into the gospel writings and what becomes the orthodoxy and the medieval religion. It becomes, even though in its earliest incarnation, as Paul writes about it in the epistles, it's radically different from the Jesus of the Gospels. They eventually find a way to marry together the epistles and the Gospels to create the New Testament canon. And then the 8th group, who end up getting merged into that group later, are the Jewish Christians, and they're the ones who are like, you have to follow Jewish law. And whether it is Jews who have converted to Christianity and carry the Jewish law with them, or whether it is Gentiles who want to join that group and agree that they're going to, follow all of the Jewish law, including circumcision, it's probably a blending of the two. Later, there are other sects that we know about that are written about in the 2nd century called the Ebionites and Nazareans, and they clearly are successors to this. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, is apparently a book that they were using in their ceremonies. And what we do know is that this did not lead to the biblical form of Christianity. It was folded in, but the biblical form of Christianity takes the opposite position, which is that you do not have to follow all of Jewish law to be a Christian. So these are the 8 earliest strands we know about. The apocalyptic strand that Stephen's talking about, the evidence for the apocalyptic strand becomes very clear after the sacking of the Temple of Jerusalem. Once the second temple is sacked, apocalyptic writing explodes all over this place in the scene. And some of these earlier communities that don't start out apocalyptic become the same group becomes more apocalyptic later. Like we know the Q community. Thanks, Ari. Good to see you. We'll talk to you next time. We know the Q community in particular, in their later layers, they begin to add apocalyptic layers to it, and it becomes an extension of their argument. And the original basis of the extension is twofold. It's natural if you've got a community that's trying to figure out what the kingdom of God looks like and is preaching publicly with people who don't agree with them and they're getting pushback. It's natural that one way that the pre-apocalyptic ideas could begin to enter are, on the one hand, look, Jesus is trying to help you here. If you don't listen to Jesus, things are going to be bad, right? This is for your own good, so you really should listen. The people who don't listen are setting themselves up for trouble. That's a pre-apocalyptic idea, and you see that in Q2. And the other pre-apocalyptic idea is, yes, in theory we can make the kingdom of God right now, but in practice it's going to take us a while to figure out what we're supposed to be doing and to convince everybody to go along. And when we do that, we will be in a new epoch, which we could think of as the kingdom of God. And dividing this epoch from that epoch is the end of the old epoch. And that's an apocalypse. That's an ending, a great ending that's coming. So this is another pre-apocalyptic idea. And if you could see how the community could adopt both of those, and once those become centerpieces of their argument, if you drop the smashing of the Temple of Jerusalem on top of that, it turns into kind of a feeling like everything is coming to an end and a real concern about the end times. It transforms those earlier pre-apocalyptic ideas into a fully apocalyptic one. And we know that by the end of the first century, we have very strongly apocalyptic groups running around. So this number 8 just goes up and up, and some of these guys change into apocalyptic groups. We'll talk more about it to come. One of the things that Burton Mack talks about early in the Lost Gospel, when he's summarizing the history of biblical scholarship, he says how in the late 19th century there was a popular notion of Jesus as a humanitarian, humanist, poor, loving teacher wandering around Galilee and Judea, and teaching people to be kind. But that picture of Jesus left out, as Stephen's pointing out, it left out the apocalyptic stuff that we see some of in some of the Gospels, and we see a lot of there's hints of it in Paul, but we see a lot of it in Revelations. And so what happened is at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the humanitarian teacher Jesus got shoved to the side in favor of a multi-decades long exploration of the apocalyptic preacher version of Jesus, the prophet who's come to declare the end times. And for several decades, there was an explosion of books written about this version, the apocalyptic version of Jesus, to try to compensate for his omission from the earlier late 19th century versions of reconstructing what Jesus was like. And so you can find some major writers on the history of Christianity who really focus on the apocalyptic side. But that fell out of fashion too. What people eventually realized is that focusing too much on humanitarian Jesus and focusing too much on apocalyptic Jesus were just two versions of the same problem, which is we're going to take a little piece and say that that's the real piece and ignore the other. And sooner or later, someone's going to look at the rest of the writings and say, yeah, but what about this part you're leaving out? So the new emerging conclusion is this idea that our concept of Jesus was created in layers, and that all of the layers are legitimate. They're all part of the early Christian experience, and that we can't exclude any one or the other just because we like some of them more than we like the others. So, Stephen's doing us a favor by reminding us of the apocalyptic side of it. And we will be talking a great deal about that when the time comes. But right now, we're just talking about the really earliest fragments we've got before Paul. Or things that Paul himself doesn't believe, but alludes to as some of his opposition, some of the people that he's trying to turn people away from. or some of the people that he thinks have seduced the churches that he set up, and now he's trying to get the churches to come back to him away from that other variant. Some of these 8 that we're talking about are some of these 7 of the 8 are some of the other versions that he alludes to. And a lot of them, if it weren't for Paul complaining about them, some of them we wouldn't know they existed at all. This is all we've got. All right, so this is our backstory, right? And this gives us some sense of kind of the early ferment. And in this early ferment, all the things that Sharon asked about when we first started into this section, they're not present yet. The idea of an imperial religion, that we're going to be an empire, and that we're going to conquer the world, and that we're going to run around looking for heretics and punish them until they either convert or die. This is totally absent. This comes later. This isn't early Christianity. And the reason for going through this history the way that we are is to underscore Kenneth's point in chapter 8, which I think we're going to finish today. And his point is that what we see in mainstream medieval Christianity is very, very different from what we see in the earliest layers of the teachings of Jesus in these early Christian communities. There is, as Kenneth is arguing, there is a transformation of the religion that's done to popularize it and make it an acceptable vehicle for empire. And oh, Ginny, you heading out? Good to see you. All right, well, why don't we switch to Kenneth, if you guys are game. Obviously, any questions, comments, or concerns, I'm happy to talk about them, but we'll go back to the text now, armed with what we've just done here. So when last we left our intrepid Kenneth, we had just finished paragraph 19, and this was the sentences we were on. He said, "But purely in concept, how can utterly active spirit be made to suffer?" This is his critique of the notion of hell. The notion that your soul will be tormented in hell for all eternity if you don't do what we say. But the problem with that is it subverts the very concept of spirit that the new epoch is founded on and it's supposed to be focused on. It makes the soul seem like a kind of body that can be tortured, which is not at all our conception of spirit that the Greeks had or anybody else at this point. In such a notion, Christian theology, by which he means, the medieval imperial Christian theology, had betrayed its very central idea. Body alone is passive matter, subject to pain and torture. Disembodied spirit cannot feel external afflictions, for spirit is by its very notion what is most godlike and sovereign in us. And when you see the word sovereign in Kenneth Smith's writing, of course, you should be thinking about autonomia and autonomy and autarkia, as Donald likes to remind us. This is what under the ancient Greek value system was considered the chief characteristics of the gods that the best human beings would try to emulate. That is, to not just be passive flotsam and jetsam on the tides of life, but to actually exercise some wise will over your own development and your own choices, to be more than a collection of symptoms or a human tape recorder, but to actually create some space between stimulus and response so that you can decide not just what is the reflexive thing to do here, in which I am a symptom of my upbringing, but what is the wise thing to do here that leads to the best outcomes. And that's the core of the eristic ethos. And so when Kenneth says spirit is by its very notion what is most godlike and sovereign in us, he's also saying it's what's most eristic in us. And it's when you see that connection that you can start to imagine how this religion could end up converting so many Greeks who are raised in the ethos that they don't want to be douloi, they don't want to be banausoi, they want to be aristoi, and that involves focusing on this thing that is sovereign within us, which is spirit. So these early Christian communities start saying, what if we're ruled not by the appetites of emperors and generals and governors? What if we're ruled by the spirit? And what if our spirits can be enriched by the purer, wiser spirit of God, so that can help us to develop our character, our ethos? If ethos anthropoi daimon, then we would like to have the defects in our own ethos displaced by the superior ethos of Jesus. and then we change our fate to something better. So all of this is part of the early kind of Hellenistic side of Christianity at this point. And you can see how that is sabotaged if we say, instead of being this active principle of growth and development and unfolding, spirit is actually just this kind of invisible body that can be tortured. It's a problem. It's a contradiction built right into the heart of the theology at a very difficult point. Now, fortunately, in the early stages of the growth and development of this religion, there's really no discussion of hell at all. As Stephen points out, by the end of the first century, there is going to be discussion of the apocalypse, and you better get yourself ready for that. But even that's not about hell per se. It's a different focus. And a lot of that focus is about why you should listen to Jesus, why you should follow these teachings, why you should do what you're supposed to do is to prepare yourself. But that's still a far cry from hell. The whole idea of the dungeon of hell, this is a century or two, maybe three away before it becomes a dominant factor. So let's move on from here into his last two paragraphs. He takes us into paragraph 20 with the opening sentence here. He says, self-interested fear for one's own soulish happiness as defined by others. Craven, slavish anxiety over displeasing the absolute master. Desperate desire to conform to an authoritative regimen with an absolute standard of right and wrong that obliterates the need for thinking or judgment. These induce Christian, and he puts it in quotes because he's not saying this is authentic Christianity, this is the corrupted form of Christianity. These induce Christian souls to turn utterly to selfish concerns for their own sake. I want to save myself. If this is that thing that when an enemies take your group prisoner and your group has solidarity and the enemies want to turn you against each other and get you to confess, to spill secrets, they often use tactics very much like this, right? It's like, well, you don't want to be the one who got left in who didn't turn on his friends when they turned on him. So otherwise all the punishment will fall on you. You want to secure your confession first so that you get to have, a lesser punishment. That sense of turning on one another for the sake of reducing punishment is Kenneth's arguing its core to this. And you see his use of slavish, and now it's Stephen here that I'm echoing because Stephen would be thinking about this too, right? Nietzsche, when he criticizes Christianity, he's not criticizing Jesus or Jesus' teachings. He's criticizing this distorted form, which Kenneth is alluding to, where it becomes about the whip that is used to whip people into obedience. And the Greeks believed to resist the whip, to hold in contempt pain or the threat of death or torture. This was the fingerprints of the eristic character. And that you can see in the earliest teachings of Jesus, they're more oriented towards the development of an eristic character. They're about questioning the things that you take for granted and asking deeper, more probing questions. But to turn it into do this or you'll get hurt is to sabotage the conditions that are necessary for the enrichment and development of an eristic character. And instead you get the doulic character, the slave who just doesn't want to displease master because he doesn't want to be punished, which the Greeks and Romans know all about, right? This is very widespread in their civilization. And so this is a way in which you say, here's a religion that starts out trying to orient towards creating aristoi, but it gets subverted into an imperial tool of control that's to develop douloi, to create an army of people who obey. And this partially explains the dialectic of the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, you get people who still have access to the original texts, and they can see that what Jesus is saying sounds like he's calling on us to try to be better people and to do good in the world. That is, he's calling on us to be eristic. And there's a clash between that and the obey or go to hell version of Christianity. And it's what causes so many mystics and desert mothers and fathers and nuns and so on to spring up in dialectical opposition. On the one hand, they are part of the church. And on the other hand, they're tugging on the church to try to get it away from this kind of slavish orientation, slave master orientation, and to try to instead move towards an eristic brotherhood of man, develop yourself into a better person and help the weak among you to develop that orientation. That tug of war goes on for 1,000 years after the medieval epoch starts. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, you're quite right that early Christianity must be Greek eristic, I think, in Kenneth's view here. But I like that phrase, an absolute standard of right or wrong obliterates the need for thinking of or judgment. There's another thing that obliterates that need that Kenneth didn't point it out here. That's no standard of right or wrong. So the eristic view is in the middle somewhere. It's what Kenneth always had, developing that connoisseurial taste, to work in the middle and find the right and wrong without either, anyway. There's one other phrase. I had it written here on my page, and I don't find Kenneth ever refers to it. He refers lots of times to this intrinsic or extrinsic or whatever. Well, there's a phrase in Greek. If you look it up, it goes, Wikipedia says it was from Aristotle, but it clearly existed in Plato, is T Heneketu, that for the sake of which. It's sort of the question that drives that Greek Aristoi. Yeah, let me I can kind of put it in Greek too,
Sweet.
Yeah, no, I got it wrong here. I could do better maybe, but T Heneca 2. The T and the 2 are the same word. This or that or which or what or whatever. But just an indirect article, but the 2 is the genitive form and the T, I think, is the nominative form. Don't trust my Greek. But this was a key thing. It's the whole concept. The question which the Socrates asked, Aristotle asked, is something intrinsic or is it extrinsic? Is it for the sake of something else or for the sake of itself? It's the question that gets asked to decide. What's your answer to that? Is something intrinsically right? Is it good in itself? Or is it a means? It's a good that we use to acquire something else or to go to something else. And I think it's kind of the question that Kenneth is asking, because he's going over and over here. Intrinsic, extrinsic, intrinsic, extrinsic. Is it, compelled? Oh well. That's enough, but
That's right on, though. I'm so glad you brought it up. I mean, intrinsic versus extrinsic goes to the heart of what he's talking about in sentence 1 here, doesn't it? So he's like, for what is the basis for deciding what it is you're supposed to be doing? Are you trying to do the right thing because it's the right thing? Or are you trying to do it to avoid punishment? Because if it's to avoid punishment, it means that someone can punish you into doing the wrong thing. If that's what it takes to not get punished, you'll do that, even if it's wrong. The Aristos wants to know what is intrinsically the right thing to do. This goes to what Stephen was saying a couple of weeks ago. Don't that a humanist says something is good does not make it good. And the humanist should be asking this intrinsic versus extrinsic question. Are you doing it because it's good? Do you think it's good because it is good, or do you think it's good because you believe it's good? Because this is the thing that humanists say. You know, what is the source of the meaning here? And it requires connoisseur judgment to work out. So another movement that's related to this, I mean, we've talked about the role of cynicism, not modern cynicism, but ancient Greek cynicism, you know, the challenging the norms and asking questions about whether the status quo is actually virtuous. You can see in the early Q stuff and in Thomas, a lot of cynic philosophers like Diogenes, their kind of aphorisms are present. But there's another element that Burton Mack really stresses that's probably playing a massive role here, but that doesn't get discussed enough, and that's Stoicism. And he says, you know, what is the Roman philosophy of Stoicism? And it's not just enduring. Oh, thank you, Stephen, for getting the wording on that right. That's right. It's not just about enduring. Stoicism is based on the premise that you have to try to be a good person, even if the dominant political economy around you is telling you to do something else. If the dominant political economy around you is telling you to do the wrong thing and they threaten you with harm, you should just endure that harm and persist in doing the right thing. To be a Stoic is to be autonomous and have autarky, to rule yourself. To say, I would rather choose pain or death than do the wrong thing. And one can see why people serving in the Roman army would adopt this. You know, it's like there's some books I'm going to read about the Roman Empire that argue that Augustus, although he's called the first Caesar, was actually not intending to be the first in line of Caesars, but rather he was trying to restore the Republic. And that when he said he was first among equals, that he meant it. That he really was trying to just put an end to all the civil wars and corruption and go back. But that's not what happened. After him, they just started appointing successors. And the successors didn't have Augustus's commitments to the Roman virtues. They grew up in a position in which the emperor can do what he wants, so they just started doing what they wanted. And this created a crisis for the rest of the empire, because up until then they could say, well, if I just do the right thing, Augustus will have my back. But under Tiberius, as Tacitus and other writers point out, if you do the right thing, Tiberius might have you killed. You know, Tiberius wanted you to obey him. He was a tyrant, effectively. He didn't stand for anything deeper or more profound. He didn't stand for anything that was intrinsically good. He defined the good as whatever he told people to do. And so the more this kind of new imperial anti-ethos arises that says it is dangerous for you to stand for anything, because if you end up standing for what you think is right, but it puts you in the path of the emperor, then you will be destroyed. With that arising as the new conditions, you can see why Stoicism becomes popular. And the argument Burton Mack makes is by the point that, you know, these Jesus communities are arising, Stoicism is very well understood as a reasonable response, and an admirable response to these uncertain times where the political economy is soulless and doesn't stand for anything. And that notion of you should be willing to get slapped in the face and laugh, scoff at the person who does it and just turn the other cheek. You know, that represents not just a cynic impulse of challenging the status quo, but a Stoic impulse of being willing to endure whatever you have to endure to do the right thing. And there is, Burton Mack argues, a direct line that leads from Stoicism through that Jesus ethos and ultimately into the martyr complexes that arise in the second and third and fourth centuries, when people are not only willing but eager to be martyred for the sake of Jesus, to demonstrate the strength of their commitment to doing what is right. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind again.
Oh, you know, the myth of the graves, I forget, the classicist who wrote all about mythology, which is Robert Graves. I forget. It's one you like, I know, but
Gilbert Murray.
huh?
Gilbert.
Not Gilbert Murray, but more modern.
Oh,
Graves, what's his name?
yeah.
But he wrote some fiction too, one of which, made movies and stuff. Like I, Claudius or something. And in there, I forget if he does it through a character or commentator or whatever. He says the key to being a successful Roman emperor, or at least thought that by the people, was to ensure that you were succeeded by someone who was even worse. Now, I think there might be really something to that. you know. I mean, it was a pretty rapid spiral down, for at least for the Augustan period, the first, was it 7 or 8 emperors or whatever? Yeah. Yeah, Robert Graves. I think but he had he had a good historical knowledge of the period and wrote fiction about it. So he might have something that explains a bit of why things went so bad so quickly.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's a fascinating study. On my reading list for this year, in addition to the early Christian works and Jewish works that I'm reading for these seminars, and the Holocaust and totalitarian and fascism works that I'm reading for current events, I've now built a list of readings about ancient Rome that I'm going to be going through again to supplement and support these seminars, and it includes some Robert Graves, some of this material about the early emperors, and trying to understand what happened. And God help me, I even have Gibbons's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire on my to-read list. So although the odds of me finishing that this year are pretty low. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I mean, really quickly, I'll just, maybe add on as to this relationship between Stoicism and some of the Christian adoptions of those same principles. Is one of the things that is that Stoicism, in a way, actually lends itself to purpose. That's something that is bigger than yourself. So then, if you just change the narrative along with that, then that, becomes something where, virtue is the only good, and that you're willing to, in order to live a good life, you have to be virtuous. So then everything else is secondary. So if you use the metaphysics, then, that you can see where that becomes a very powerful kind of combination. Obviously it, when you manipulate the metaphysics, it becomes, kind of a problem in and of itself. But you can see why these things were adopted, because it builds a certain resilience into the individual. The other thing is that there is the relationship aspect, and if you look at how the relationships are in cosmopolitanism specifically, that you're focused on seeing, the being a citizen of the world, seeing everybody as equal, and that's can kind of take that and say it's made in the image of God. So I mean, obviously, cardinal virtues exist both in Stoicism and Christianity. So it's, the theological virtues are the difference. So what they're doing is changing the relationship with, as opposed to individual, you're going from individual to God to individual, and you worry about who's that God figure, that, or the conduit, like the person that's actually saying they have the messages. So that's where things can get distorted, and that's where power structures start to come into play and to distort messages themselves. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons as to, why, Christianity would adopt this some of the fundamentals, because there is this, this dedication to something outside of yourself that lends itself to purpose and meaning, which is interesting because when you say there's a crisis of meaning today, well, then how do you then solve that? And that's where having a philosophical approach, understanding the virtues themselves, understanding the ethics, can bring purpose and meaning to people's lives, as opposed to them identifying with certain externals like a job. Because as this become more challenging, you can see where that can fill a void. Sorry.
Thank you, Joe. It's good. So I'm going to take us back to the text, but I just kind of want to drop another. Until we get to the point where I can actually start introducing the the words that are in opposition to the orthodoxy, from various writers. I'm just going to have to keep dropping little teasers. So one of the teasers, I just picked up a set of my latest set of books here, and largely in support of this seminar. This one is it's from Penguin Classics. It's called The Desert Fathers, but they make it clear that they also mean the Desert Mothers. It's just they tend to be called the Desert Fathers. Sayings of the early Christian monks. Sayings of the early Christian monks. And we will eventually get to this. It may be a couple of months, but we'll eventually get to this. And it's important because it represents, after this early fertile period that we're going through now, where there's a whole bunch of alternatives, and the dominant orthodoxy hasn't even emerged yet. We're going to go through a period where it's the dominant emerging dominant emerging orthodoxy versus all of what it calls heresies, and that's where we're going to see a lot of what Kenneth is writing about here in this chapter being illustrated. But I got to make sure we don't do short shrift to the other side, which is that it's not just that medieval orthodoxy versus Jesus, because there are all these other writers throughout the medieval period who keep harking back to Jesus's message and taking it into new and interesting directions. And one of them comes from all these hermits who kind of run off into the desert and say, okay, the political economy of Rome is too corrupt. I can't hear Jesus clearly in all the turmoil of Roman culture. So I'm going to withdraw into the desert of Egypt. And there I'm going to meditate and think and focus and write. And in that, try to find the true voice of Jesus coming through the writings that are available to us. And these people produced spiritual writings that were influential upon, the next 1,000 years of history. And some of them continue to be influential to this day. And they're going to sound they too are Christians, and they're going to sound very different from the kind of people that Kenneth is criticizing here. They're going to sound a lot more like Jesus. And we'll get a lot more like, we'll get Francis, we'll get Claire, we'll get all kinds of people writing later. But for now, let's go back to Kenneth. Paragraph 20, sentences 2 through 3. Just how far these social and political controls corrupted medieval Christian principles can be seen by how very, very few medieval Christians comprehend this simple point. The very idiom of reward and punishment, of course, betrays all intrinsic values in religion, love, gratefulness, respect, awe, etc. It converts religious motivation into a mechanical, truly amoral extrinsicalism, and there's the intrinsic versus extrinsic that Donald was talking about, with everything being done for the sake of, right? For the sake of, so T henekatu, for the sake of an externally related and applied reward or punishment. And this was always the classical Greeks' criticism of what they called slave mentality, and it will later be Nietzsche's criticism of what he sees as the renewed slave mentality of the modern world, is this notion of people as merely the next domino in a series to be mechanically knocked down because they have no distance between stimulus and response. They do what it takes to avoid the whip and to go get the banana, and they just aren't willing to act like moral agents who can choose something other than I was mechanically prodded into doing this as easily as if I were a machine and someone pushed my button. You don't want to be a walking, talking tape recorder. You don't want to be a walking, talking utensil. You want to be a person. That's closer to the authentic, message of Jesus, in as much as it also reflects the heuristic ethos of the Hellenistic world and the cosmopolitan Hellenistic Greco-Roman world that Galilee was marinating in. So let's take it a little further. Sentences 4 through 5. Aristotle was far brighter than modern behaviorists. He understood that by the application of pain and pleasure, human youths could be conditioned to desire, believe, or think anything whatsoever. And the implication is, including what is wrong or bad, what is sick. You can condition people to believe it and act on it through pain and pleasure. Therefore, it was all that much more crucial to use these sanctions, pain and pleasure, to reinforce the healthiest and highest values practically possible for a given individual's character. That is, while somebody is in that mode where they are still plastic, their character is still plastic and can be shaped, you want to use pain and pleasure to shape it to become resistant to pain and pleasure. You want to shape it to where they can see the deeper principles at work and choose things based on, how healthy or high they are, and not based on whether it gives immediate satisfaction or avoids immediate pain. And he finishes, but for Aristoi, who think and judge in terms of what is intrinsically right and good, such reinforcement can only be corruptive. Right? Trying to whip somebody who is already doing their best to think about what's healthy and high, and just trying to, punish them or reward them to get them to do what you want instead. It's a perverse incentive. It's like offering an alcoholic a bottle. It's human beings and our character, we have to try to stack the deck in the favor of doing what takes us in the direction of sophrosyne, and creating a society that does the opposite of that, or creating a imperial version of a religion that does the opposite of that in order to get people to obey secular authorities is ultimately corruptive of the quest to create whole, healthy, mature adult minds capable of making moral decisions and doing the right thing. He continues, sentences 6 through 8. The drives of pleasure and pain are, as Bentham knew, what humans have in common with animals. These are the lowest motives we have, and the only motives that the lowest personality types among us have. Homicide detectives recognize the psychological or psychical fingerprints of such mentalities in the way they commit crimes, like the hot psychopath versus the cold psychopath. And we all see the movies, TV, and publications and hear the music that caters to the overwhelmingly hedonist. In our time, their culture has grown crass and gross enough to nauseate even the most tolerant. It's like, what can a civilization hope to achieve if its focus is not on making it easier for people to seek the healthiest and highest, but instead catering to what is the most corrupting in them? And then the corruption just spreads. And then you end up with a situation like we have today. Yay! 2026 is off to such a great start. He wraps up paragraph 20 as follows. But it was the historical ingenuity of the church to realize that there were ways of recasting Christian doctrine to make it compelling even to the nearly bestial. And so this takes us back to the point he was making a couple weeks ago earlier in the earlier paragraph, that you have a choice when you're structuring a religion. You have a choice about whether your central message is designed to appeal to people who are all about pain and pleasure, or whether it's designed to try to teach people not to focus on pain and pleasure, and instead to be stoic about those things and focus on what's healthiest and highest. And the problem is, if you focus on pain and pleasure, you reach the largest audience because more people are ready to hear about how not to hurt, or how to be transactional and get money in return for something. That enormous numbers of people are ready for. But learning that those concerns are the wrong concerns, even though most people believe in them, that those are the wrong concerns. And we should be focused on deeper things that are necessary for the survival of civilization and the creation of heuristic personalities. Most people are not going to want to hear that. They're just not receptive. It doesn't make sense to them. Their lives don't include that third dimension of life. And so if that's your religion, most people won't adopt it. And Jesus, Kenneth's argument is that Jesus was in fact arguing for, yeah, sure, you want to be kind to a lot of people, but you got to understand a lot of people aren't going to understand your message. You have to be willing to be discriminatory about, people who don't have eyes to see or ears to hear, towns that just aren't gonna, that they can't get out of their crass materialism, they can't get out of their transactionalism. You have to be willing to shake the dust of that town off your sandals. In other words, you can't be catering to the lowest common denominator. You have to be structuring the religion to try to achieve the highest, so you can do the most good in the world. But in the process of becoming a religious empire, the church realizes it can reach more people if it just ignores that part of what Jesus said and instead says, let's go ahead and cater to the lowest common denominator. Because that way we get more people. And the more people we have, the stronger we are. And the biggest church will win. And this becomes the argument. And granted, as he acknowledges earlier in this paragraph, there is another argument to be made, which is if you can get them in the door by appealing to the things they understand, maybe that gives you an opportunity later to try to cultivate them into something higher. And the nobler members of the medieval church hierarchy are thinking along those lines. And they're thinking that the compromises made to get them in the door won't sabotage their later efforts to try to help them arise. But Kenneth's argument is that's a dicey proposition. It's hard enough to get people to arise, even if you don't start by watering down your message. So there is this issue of perverse incentives. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just have one kind of quick question, because this is something that I've kind of given thought to lately, and for various reasons, as to to what degree can, at a societal level, virtue be taught. And so I'm just wondering, in the sense, what would Kenneth's approach be? I mean, obviously there's a couple different ways you can go about that. The founders had a lot of discussions along these lines. The idea of specifically Jefferson would take more of an educational approach, and gave a lot of credit for self-governance, meaning for the individuals to manage their passions, whereas Adams was much more on the institutional side. And in thinking you have to have strong institutions that help shape the your citizenry, so that they can become good citizens. So then what is really Kenneth's thought on that, and how would he maybe execute that? I think it's given that education is part of this, so far as that, just basically even being aware of what it means to live a good life. Like, that's a question in it of, people are never even asked. So, I mean, and giving people philosophy would be another step, so that they would have a framework and be able to at least contemplate some of the decisions that they're making. So I mean, I see those things, and those are kind of straightforward no-brainers, and so but I think that how do you go about shaping citizenries, because also the institutional aspect of it is pretty interesting, because it's fine if the institution's not corrupt, but if the institution's corrupt, it's not exactly all that helpful, because they're only going to obviously shape individuals to their ends. Now, clearly, so the institutions have to be kind of, there has to be a certain degree of integrity in the institutions, and the citizens have to have a trust in the institutions themselves as well. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think of how he would go about this in a very practical way, maybe. And I mean, obviously, this is such a big question, and that you can't do justice to it in a short amount of time. But it's a question that I thought about it, because you also don't want to impose on the autonomy of people as well. So there has to be a healthy respect here. So there's a lot of nuance that goes into this when it means that cultivation of a citizenry that is acting responsibly, and that is choosing the good. So anyway, that's kind of a long question, but it is, I think the fundamental part is, to what degree can it be taught, has to be answered first. And I think it's better to teach it than not teach it. So that part I can get, but even what are the limits in that, in that process? So anyway.
Yeah, the classical Greek position on this is interesting because, I mean, their argument is, on the one hand, nature abhors a monoculture and it doesn't produce a single kind of human being. It produces multiple kinds of people with multiple kinds of character. And so how you approach each of these people has to be different. And to what extent are people born into one character type and stuck there for life, versus to what extent do these character types represent stages of development that somebody could be cultivated out of a lower one into a higher one, is something the Greeks themselves can't make up their minds about. They're unsure. They themselves say that they have never managed to get their own political economy and culture firing on all cylinders. They have ideas about how to do this that they've never fully executed. And so they don't know what the capacity for change is. They do recognize that the city states that put the most effort into cultivating, people, are able to have a higher percentage of aristoi than the city states that don't. That was certainly Athens's brag, was that they had they managed to get as much as a third of their population to be aristoi.
Yeah, that's
normal, but
that's a great point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's such a good point. You don't have to have the whole population. You just have to have part of it.
Yeah, it's like, in some sense, it's like the yeast in the dough. Everybody can rise. And one of the points that they made is that just because someone is a doulos doesn't mean you know exactly what they're going to do, because there's an enormous amount of variation in how people express their character. So you can have civilizations where people might be douloi, but they're still impregnated with an enormous amount of wisdom literature and insight. And they're really, really good douloi. I mean, as douloi go, they're acting at a much higher level than a doulos in a culture that treats them as a disposable utensil and doesn't cultivate them at all. And then they end up operating at this kind of low slavish mentality that doesn't have potential for improvement. And so, there's a political science that needs to exist, where we should be running social experiments with education to find out to what extent, can people self-actualize, and to what extent are they stuck. We don't really know the answer. And in the modern world, we don't really care. We pretend that we care, but we're really mass producing commodities for the market. So, as long as they're profitable, we don't care whether they're self-actualized, whether they're aristoi. So the question you're asking is basically an unresolved one. But what the Greeks believed was that if you want to try to create the cultural conditions necessary to increase the percentage of aristoi and to raise the floor on the quality of your douloi and banausoi, you really need to put every cultural resource you have towards it. It should be all arrows pointing to the same goal. What you should not have is say, well, my economy is going to be used to make as much money as possible, but I suppose I'll put a little bit of money towards education and maybe it'll do some good. The Greeks said, well, that's bound to fail. Because they put everything they had, they thought, into trying to engage in anthropoculture. And they saw some progress, and it was hopeful, but the experiment ended before they could get very far. So you're asking the question that is like the most important question about the future of the human race.
And yeah, I think the experiment part is an interesting point, because that requires extreme caution. Just look at the turn of the century, where then it became the IQ was exactly, that's the most important thing. And, even some of the questionable, not only approaches, but even the scoring itself, even though a lot of people, will obviously say there's a lot of correlations between that. Does it really make for a good citizenry or a good, kind of a good, country? So, and I mean, it can turn into eugenics really quickly. And so the idea of, it's a very delicate balance that has to be kind of struck within that, frame. So it's a tough question.
It's a tough question, but it's the right question. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Joe, are you asking if virtue can be taught?
In so many, to what degree? Well, to what degree can it be taught? In other words, because it can be. I mean, there's always the ability to teach to a point where people, may not be. They'll be better than they otherwise would. And Franklin was actually very, well, kind of used to say, he would.
I'm not asking you to give me the method by which we would teach it. I just wondered if that was kind of your question. Because what seems to me that question is debated all through Greek society and Plato and Aristotle and whatever. But what seems, I mean, I'll say this, Kenneth, in the course of, let's see, he's about 80 now. He started, I was about, 72. So maybe he's taught for 60 years or so, 50 something years. He's literally taught dozens of students about virtue,
Yeah. Yeah.
which would make you feel pretty depressed. But what I think is encouraging, if we examine this, is that when we concentrate on it has to be taught, then there has to have been a first teacher. But we're pretty sure there wasn't. I think what we should find solace in, I think, is that it continues to be rediscovered, to be that what Kenneth has brought forth, what other people you may know and I may know in our lives have reached some degree of wisdom, largely on their own. I mean, there's a funny dialogue somewhere where Socrates, some sophist, is going to nail him down, and he says, now, we're going to debate, and you're going to answer my questions just so I can understand them. So, and he's using this as a technique to try and trap Socrates. And Socrates, he says, well, I'll answer your questions, but whether you understand the answers is on you, not me.
Right.
Is that people continue to rediscover virtue through thousands of years. Whether it's been, whether there's been a break in the chain of teacher to student or not, people just somehow in their own lives come to a realization that, hey, the good may be real. There may be forms of human life, of behaviors that are better than others. And it gets rediscovered all over again, and the inquiry begins anew. If we didn't have that feature, well, we would be lost.
We might not be here.
Well, I just think, it's like there's so much on can it be taught. I just think, thank God it can be learned and can be self-taught. Because if that couldn't happen, once it went out, it would be gone forever.
I think that's the better question. What can be learned and how is it learned? I think that might be the better question to think about. Because that there's a lot of there's been discussions around that obviously for a very long time too.
Well,
but that's the whole philosophy of mind, area. So.
Yeah, thank you for this. This is great. And it goes back to what Stephen asked in the chat when he says, is the good loved by the humanists because it is good, or is it good because it is loved by the humanists? And the core argument, which the two of you just brought up in the transformation of that question, takes us back to Aristotle and the Greeks generally, and their argument that what is good isn't good because we say so. It's good because it is there in nature to be found as good for those who search to try to learn what the good is. And thus, the world itself can teach us, if we are open to it, if we don't hold it in contempt and ignore it, if we search, we think searchingly about, explore searchingly these questions, with the larger world that has experiences beyond our parochial ones. It's a complex issue, and of course the goal is, when we talk about creating a society that helps to cultivate people more rapidly, the goal is to make it so that it doesn't take 20 generations to accumulate a certain amount of wisdom. You say, well, let's at least get those 20 generations of wisdom taught off the bat out of the culture, and then see if the resulting students can then go on and discover new things and advance society by discovering things in nature that we weren't prepared to find there. This all makes sense within the ancient framework that nature, that the sacred is part of nature, and the meaning of life is part of nature. It's immanent in the cosmos and not separate from it, because then that means the cosmos holds the secrets for those who search. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I would just like to go back to the last sentence in the paragraph we just read, as to whether or not we can teach virtue. But it was the historical ingenuity of the church to realize that there are ways of recasting Christian doctrine, which I think is the virtuous doctrine, to make it compelling, even to the nearly bestial. And that comes back to the point that it was all about control. And virtue exists in a society depending on the leadership of the society, because the leadership of the society, particularly if it has economic leadership, and it tends even slightly toward virtue, then people will follow, because they will create, that environment will also be created in the homes. And I think we can see it in the country we're living with here. I interact with a lot of people. People are not as kind as they can be anymore, because the common discourse is to be unkind, right? And so virtue can be taught, but I think it comes from the leadership, and it just varies over time. I don't know what the Greeks did, because there was the Aristoi, then there was the rest of them. The rest of them just kind of went along based on what their economic opportunity was. And during the medieval time, I keep coming back to this point. The construction of those churches kept the people in line, because that's where they learned. That's where they learned their virtue, from painting those stories on the wall and making those stained glass windows. So that's what kept them in line. You can correct me if I am, please correct me if that's not an appropriate assumption. Thank you.
That's right. That was the architecture that they were aiming for, would try to make it so that with the structure of these churches and these stained glass windows, we have the first steps towards learning what we have to teach you. You don't need the book. And another human being who knows more can take you on a tour through the church of the stained glass windows, and step by step you learn more of the story and more of what all of this is about. And the hope then would be that this is drawing you into the search for virtue.
But I think the political operational mission of the Christian church established in the medieval times is still fairly operative today.
Yes. Yes. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I think, Rick, you're aiming at a rational Jesus, and I've embraced the irrational Jesus. But
Which is
I was
fine. There's plenty of Jesuses to go around.
I was looking at again Schelling. Schelling's lectures, his 1840, 1841 lectures, which it's a bit like the events, in Kung Fu, where one guy sees the tiger, they see the tiger and the crane fighting, and one monk decides the crane's a trip, and the other monk decides the tiger's a trip. Well, Kierkegaard and Engels both went to Schelling's lectures, and they came away with different results. Engels was very critical of Schelling, and Kierkegaard at first was rather critical, and then he changed his mind. And what Schelling said to him, and he used this, he talked about the negative philosophy and the positive philosophy, and he warned that Hegel was only engaging the negative philosophy. And can you guess what those two philosophies are? The negative philosophy is rationalism, and the positive philosophy is empiricism. I have heard it said that existentialism is a variety of empiricism. And Schelling even used the word existential in his lecture. And his warning is the empirical precedes the rational. An example of this is in some medieval, Meister Singer comes up with Parsifal. That's a story about the dumbest of the knights. There are the smart knights and the dumbest knight. And the smart knights were having a pretty good time in Camelot. They knew the ropes, they knew all the rules, and the dumbest knight didn't. But then when they had to go out into the wilderness to find the Holy Grail, all the rationalists grew up. The knight that makes it to the Grail isn't the rational one, because he asks questions. He doesn't have preconceived ideas. He's not dominated by preconceptions. He is a little bit, and that's one of his tragedies. And it was a warning about personalities, because the dark figure in it, Klingsor, they say is based on an actual Dark Ages bishop. And it's a warning about a guy who's smart, who's taught all the virtues as ideas against, a guy like Percival, who goes out and screws up and has an epiphany. And this is the trouble when we try to find the perfect set of ideas and perfect set of values, and we're all just going to follow the orders. The perfect model of what society is supposed to be. And it's not actually based on anything that's in flesh and blood. In the end, we'll create a pipe as our perfect society and try to reduce human beings to jelly so they better go through the pipe. This is literally what's happening. And it gets a bit, this whole question of Hegel's triad that, we had anthropos, physis, and theos. And we decided God was dead. Okay, we're only left with anthropos and physis. And we thought we were pretty smart, didn't we? Now they're saying physis is dead. I mean, we literally have government leaders saying there's no such thing as men and women. How could you be that dumb? You really have to be either completely dishonest or completely stupid to come up with one like that. But literally they want to make it law because there is no such thing as nature. There's only anthropos. Anthropos has its limitations. It's a good thing. This is where we are now. They thought they were so smart, and there was Nietzsche's warning. You're all standing there thinking you're so smart. Well, you're not as smart as you like to think you are, and this is what you've got to watch out for.
Okay.
Sorry for my rants. I'll just go back to worshipping the irrational Jesus again.
Well, actually, I'm going to wrap up by underscoring your point, and I'm going to do it as follows. Remember that we don't have anything written by Jesus to tell us what Jesus thought and said and did. We only have what these early Christian communities said, and they wildly disagree with each other. And we know there were more than the ones that we have fragments of documentation for. Now, as you might remember, and we're going to experience when we get to Mark, one of Mark's core themes is that Jesus' disciples didn't understand a damn thing he was saying. And Jesus gets angrier and angrier over the course of Mark until in the end, he doesn't want to tell them anything. He thinks they're a bunch of idiots. And so one way to read the absence of the apocalyptic Jesus in the 8 threads that Burton Mack lists is that of course there were apocalyptic Christians in the very first generation. Then we just don't have the evidence because we don't have most of the evidence. All we have is a terrible signal to noise ratio. But another way to read it is imagine for a moment that not one of the early Jesus communities was apocalyptic. That still doesn't prove Jesus wasn't apocalyptic, because if Mark is right, they all got it wrong. Right? Because that's Mark's argument. Jesus is trying to tell them something and they're not hearing it. So in no way am I meaning to rule out apocalyptic Jesus. I'm absolutely not. That could easily be where Jesus was. I'm not taking a position on it. That's my position. I'm just taking us through what evidence we have, and that's as close as I can get. And the rest I leave up to all y'all. So with that, I guess next week we'll do the final paragraph of chapter 8 and then move on to chapter 9. Hope y'all had a lovely time. I certainly did. And have a great week, everyone.
Hope you all had a happy new year, as it came.
Happy New Year, Sharon. Happy New Year, Rick. And Stephen, the Grinch of Australia.
Donna and Barbara and Jason and Joe and David. Always so glad. Take care, everyone.
Okay.